Good morning, and welcome to the last day of the Techlandia Summit. My name is Skip Newberry, President and CEO of the Technology Association of Oregon. Last night we wrapped up the design sprint portion. We had about 7 different teams participating and 7 different solutions that were presented. And later on this morning during the town hall from 11 to noon, Kara Snow from the TAO team is going to give a little recap of some highlights from the design sprint and where we go next with some of those projects. For today's session, Riley O'Brien on our team is going to be providing back-end support and logistics on this event and the subsequent sessions later on this morning. And a couple of rules of engagement to review before we get started. All participants have been muted, and we'll ask that you please remain on mute unless a TAO staff member calls on you to talk. And you may ask or respond to questions in the chat box, publicly or privately, by directing your message to me or to TAO admin. We'll monitor the chat box throughout the conversation today, and we'll respond throughout the discussion. We'll ask you all to engage by the participant icon on your screen. We also encourage engagement through social media, so feel free to take screenshots or share your thoughts over social media throughout, and we'll be sure to reshare appropriately as well. Also wanted to mention that this session and the sessions this morning will be recorded, and the recordings will be made available on TAO's YouTube channel since it's Friday, most likely early next week. And a huge thank you to all of the supporters and investors in the Techlandia Summit and Design Sprint. Those include Portland State University, AT&T, Portland General Electric, Google, Comcast, Autodesk, Portland Trailblazers, and also the League of Oregon Cities. We really appreciate all their support, and we're excited to explore topics as we've done the last week or so on economic resiliency, future of work, human factors, and mobility. As we look back at the last week, we've got a lot of really interesting both projects and policy recommendations that came out of the variety of sessions. We're also really grateful to have a number of thought leaders from around the region as well as from around the country who were able to share some of their insights with us across these topics. And what I'm excited about this morning is that we have a chance to explore some of the connection points between these various themes. And so first up, we're going to have a conversation about mobility and the future of work. And leading that conversation for us, or facilitating it, will be Adrian Permine, who's with DKS Associates. And he's the National Director for Smart Cities and Connected Vehicles there. And we also have as panelists, Tim Papandreou, founder of Emerging Transport Advisors. And he's got a ton of experience in the public sector as well as in the private, helping transform organizations and transportation systems, and a really interesting perspective that I think can draw from both national and global experience. And we have Alex Paraskevas, who's the Business Retention and Expansion and Rural Innovation Catalyst at SEDCOR. And for those who are not familiar with SEDCOR, it's an economic development entity that's based in the Salem area and services most of the Mid-Valley in Oregon. Some really interesting work that they've been doing, and we're pleased to have them join the panel. So Adrian, floor is yours.
All right, thanks Skip, and good morning everyone. Thanks for joining on our last day wrap-up session. I'm Adrian Permine with the consulting firm DKS Associates, a local transportation planning and engineering firm here in Portland, and I'm leading up our practice in emerging transportation and new mobility as DKS's National Director for Smart Cities and Connected Vehicles. And I am really honored to be moderating this session with Tim and Alex. We are combining some of the key topics, maybe the cross-cutting topics is a better way of...
He must have been drunk.
Must
have been drunk.
Robin, sorry, you're unmuted.
Oh.
Okay. I don't know how she knew that about me already, but we're going to be talking about the cross-connection of the future of work tracks and the mobility tracks. And I had a chance, we didn't have a lot of time to prepare for it because it's been kind of rolling on the fly as the week has gone on, but Alex and Tim and I had a chance to talk about a little bit of the crossover of these tracks. And what I think is so fascinating about this is I think each of us probably had a slightly different perception of where the conversation might go. I certainly had some thoughts in my head when I talk with folks in the emerging transportation and emerging mobility space, and I hear about all of the disruption that's happening with connected autonomous vehicles and scooters and automation. My brain jumps to a very specific set of topics about the future of work that's very focused in that space. And we will be talking a little bit about that. But Alex and his perspective, both as the business retention and expansion role at SEDCOR, but also the rural innovation and working together with the ag companies around our state, has very different lens into the future of work, and transportation and mobility is a huge piece of that. So we went down a really interesting track there, and Tim's got background that crosses over a lot of these different topics. So I think I think this is going to be pretty fun. What I thought I'd do first to get us started is, Alex, maybe just have you introduce yourself a little bit, describe SEDCOR as an agency, and describe your roles here, and just leave it at the introduction. I want Tim to do the same, and then I'll start some canned questions. As Skip mentioned, I think in the introduction, really want to encourage folks to go ahead and put questions into the Zoom group chat. You can send them privately to me as the moderator, but I'm also quite happy, and in most cases almost prefer that folks go ahead and do it to everyone, so everyone else can see the question. And depending on how things go and how we're doing on time, I may even take you off mute and go ahead and have you engaged in the conversation, but we also might run out of time very quickly. So why don't we start off, Alex, with a quick introduction?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Thanks for having me. So I work for SEDCOR. We are the Strategic Economic Development Corporation. We're based in Salem, and we cover Marion, Polk, and Yamhill counties in the Willamette Valley. Economic development is relatively new to me. I've been here for about a little over 2 years. So it's completely nebulous in lots of ways, in my estimation. So, we basically look at sort of 3 parts to it: business retention and expansion. So we have 3 business retention and expansion managers, 1 for each county, Polk, Yamhill, and Marion. I cover Polk County. And that means working with existing businesses to make sure that they're happy, healthy, growing, et cetera. The businesses that we focus on are traded sector. So that's legislatively defined as sort of anything that's manufactured or grown or what have you, that is then sold into a nationally or internationally competitive market. So basically anything you make here and you sell, if you're a business that does that, we want to make sure that everything is, sort of kosher on your end. So whether that's workforce challenges, whether, working with K-12 or, career technical education programs to feed into, further jobs, whether that's honestly permitting. Oregon's not a heavy incentives kind of state, but we kind of do that too. But that's kind of the bulk of our work. Probably about 80–85% is just pounding pavement and talking to people and building relationships with folks and businesses. We are, we're a nonprofit, but we're a public-private partnership. So 60% of our funding comes from municipal contracts with cities and counties. And then we're a membership organization. So we have about 400 members that pay dues. And a lot of times that's a pay it forward. We work with a member or a business on a project, and then, hey, other dues paying members, let us be here because we're agnostic whether we work with a member or not. But then they'll join usually later. The other part of what we do is recruitment. So if, and we work statewide leads. So Business Oregon, which is the state's economic development department, a lot of times will give us a Project Acme. Project Acme will give us a spec of, what kind of, they want, how many acres, rail served, et cetera. And then we try to play matchmaker with properties or, whether that's bare ground or an existing building. And then the other piece that we focus on, and more recently, is sort of building an entrepreneurial ecosystem and working with startups sort of all stripes, but especially traded sector kind of growth businesses, to matchmake that, to matchmake for resources and whatnot, And I think sort of the underlying piece of all of this is focus on community development. So I think we fundamentally believe and pursue, and it's not an official tagline or anything, but it's sort of healthy communities are built on healthy businesses employing people in healthy jobs. And so I think if you look through that lens, you can see, and once you see sort of how the tax base works and how cities grow and how it all sort of plays together, that's kind of it at its core. So I'd say that's probably pretty quick and easy. And I mean, it's taken me a couple years to be able to distill it down to a couple minutes, but that's kind of our core book of business. So.
Cool, thanks, Alex. One of the, when we were getting together to kind of prepare briefly for this, I shared a story with Alex. I grew up down in the neck of the woods where he's working. In fact, he works now on the rural innovation with my cousins who are still running our family farm, just 20 minutes north of Salem. One of the other things I shared with them is that SEDCOR has an annual Workforce Leadership Award. That's the Mary Piermine Workforce Leadership Award, named after my mom, who's the first woman county commissioner down there in Marion County. So I've got, I had the honor of coming down the first 2 years that was an award and actually helping give it out. So I've got lots of love for SEDCOR. Tim, I'm gonna hand it over to you to introduce yourself. Skip introduced you as the founder of Emerging Transport Advisors. So I'm excited to hear, or at least share with everyone what you're doing there. You and I got to know each other years ago when you were at the city of San Francisco and at San Francisco Muni as the Chief Innovation Officer. And we were both working with our respective cities, taking us to the finalist level of the Smart Cities Challenge with the US DOT. Made an interesting jump when you left the government side and went over into Google and helped them spin off Google X into the Waymo self-driving car program. So you've got lots of interesting public and private leading edge experience. So I'm sorry to steal all your thunder of your intro, but I thought I'd speed it up a little bit and get you to the good stuff of what you're doing with emerging transport in particular.
Yeah, and good morning. Thank you for having me. I think the most important thing I want to say is that I just realized after our conversation with Alex that we both have Greek ancestry. That was one interesting thing. But the other interesting thing was that all of my hazelnuts, actually my filberts, are from the Valley. So we have a co-op store here in San Francisco that I get all of my bulk produce from and all of my nuts and seeds and things. And the majority of, actually my favorite nut is hazelnut. But I always knew they were called filberts because that's the variety, but they're from your valley, which is really nice. And your blueberries are from your valley as well. So I thought that was really cool because they're my favorite things, and I love food, and I really think that people who work in the agricultural space are really, that's actually where the future is. And you see the towns that are much more connected with those spaces, that's where a lot of the resiliency action and learning is right now. So a little bit about my background. Adrian, you covered the bulk of the previous work, which we can leave it at there. But yeah, just worked at Google X, launched the service Waymo in Arizona. Before that was the Chief Innovation Officer with the City of San Francisco as a municipal transport agency for about 8 years. And we developed a lot of these public and private partnerships, mostly focused around economic development and figuring out ways how mobility wasn't actually the reason why we were in existence. It was to actually support and enable economic opportunity and economic and sustainable development. And we had a lot of programs that really were cutting edge in San Francisco for the United States. Things like, you know, joint development policies, trip cap policies, where we capped the number of trips that new developments could create out of single occupant driving versus increasing walking public transport and ride hailing services. We developed one of the first mobility wallets where developments basically required in the homeowner association fees a mobility pass so that people didn't have to have driving as their first choice. So we did a lot of these different things that reduced the cost of the development, that increased the cost, that increased the opportunity for affordable housing. It reduced the infrastructure burden on the city. So we did a lot of these really cool partnerships. And now with Emerging Transport Advisors, what we do is we work mainly with companies, governments, startups, and research institutions to really figure out how do we communicate and how do we facilitate the transition towards all of these big mega trends that are happening in mobility. Some of these mega trends are people really now having more choices other than owning their own car and sharing other services or using different modes of transport than they would normally, using all of that data and technology that's happening right now to link all those things together. And we also help government understand its role in its governance and how to manage, how to shift from being an infrastructure provider to being more of a mobility manager and managing the transport systems they want. And that touches a lot of the things that we're talking about here, especially the future of work. And then we work with startups to help them learn how to engage more with these public and private partnerships and be a bit more, we help them become much more aware of all the nuances and all of the peculiarities of working with government and governance and all the other, with nonprofit groups, et cetera, because it is different. It's a different way of thinking. It's a different way of discussing things. Many startups are agile by nature. They can quickly maneuver and shift around things very quickly. They can experiment very quickly. Large government organizations and large companies cannot. They have a very structured bureaucracy for a reason. So we help them navigate all of these spaces, and we have clients all over the world. So have perspectives that sometimes don't apply that are North American, European, but we also work with Latin America, Africa, and Asia, which have very different parameters. So it's always important to know that while there is a best practice from this place in the world, it may not exactly translate to this part of the world because of the different situations. So we figure out ways of saying, well, what's the process that we can mirror versus the outcome, which will be different. So I'll leave it at that because I think we have a lot to talk about.
We do. And the flip side of getting the opportunity to work internationally like that is we can get sort of caught in our way of doing things over here that we think are the right way of doing them in North America. And we can learn an awful lot of lessons from other parts of the world. And I don't think we'll go down this rabbit hole too much in today's chat because we'll run out of time. But as we recover from COVID as a society, and we're all paying attention to the news and seeing how we're already hitting speed bumps and yellow lights in that recovery process. But I do think looking to what has been successful in other parts of the world, especially with things like public transportation and some of these other things, it's going to be pretty critical to us doing this right way because we don't have a playbook right now. So they're in many cases a little bit ahead of us. I want to bounce it back to you, Alex, though, and try to keep us on the focus of the intersection discussion. When you were first asked to join in this discussion and thinking about the confluence of mobility and future of work from the kind of work that you do and the kind of things you've heard over the last few days in this conference, what really resonated with you on where those worlds come together?
Well, I'll admit I have not actually participated very much in this past week, so I don't have tons to reflect on necessarily there. When we were having our call sort of about the future of work, when you're talking, when Tim was talking about congestion and things like that, it's it sort of applies to where we're at for sure here in the Mid-Valley, but it's a little bit of a different discussion for sure because I live in downtown Independence. So I'm 5 blocks from the Willamette River. I'm 4 blocks from Main Street. So there's not much congestion. We have 2 stoplights in this town. So it's not crazy. But when we're talking about as we look to recruit companies to the area, well, a lot of times big businesses, right, still care about access to I-5. Especially manufacturers, they still care about how rail served, of which you can't really find those properties anymore. But people are still thinking about sort of location, of course. And so the congestion problem that we would have here is that if you're west of I-5, sort of west of Salem, that's a pinch point because the only way to get to I-5 is functionally through downtown Salem. And so that becomes difficult. So you look at number of trucks per day, we're still, we're living in the now for sure, and not looking for the 5 or 10 years necessarily of those kinds of transportation infrastructure pieces. When you talk about the future of work, that one's very interesting to me, especially around agriculture, because I'm relatively new to agriculture. So Adrian, this is definitely much more in your wheelhouse, but I've become a passionate advocate sort of for the growers in our region. And just to like quick hit the facts, just for some context, we grow 170 different crops in this 3-county area out of 225 in the state. 97% of Oregon farmers are family farms. Average farm size is right under 500 acres. So we are not sort of this big production agriculture piece. I would say the breakpoint generally for sort of employment comes at about roughly 1,000 acres, right? So at 1,000 acres, you can probably do that by yourself with a few other hired hands, depending on crops. If you go bigger than that, you're going to start having sort of full-time employment. And I think these are rough numbers, obviously, but that's kind of what I found. And so when you talk about automation and those kinds of things in agriculture, mostly it's just replacing jobs that they can't hire for. It's not necessarily displacing anybody. It's just like, man, we can't find enough people to do X or Y. One of the good examples of that that I've seen, not necessarily from a replacement standpoint, but from a moving job role standpoint, one of my favorite places, and Kara Snow from TAO, I don't think she's on this call, but I took Kara there as well. It's one of her favorite places now, which is the Rick Rial Dairy, which is just in the town of Rick Rial. If you've driven to Lincoln City from Salem, you've passed/smelled the Rick Rial Dairy. And they have 3,500 cows, and it's a 24/7, 365 operation, because dairy is the most insane of all agricultural ventures. But they put in an automated calving barn. So they have robotic feeders for calves that mix formula on the spot based on the calf. So, the calf walks through a chute, reads the RFID tag, and then mixes formula and probiotics or whatever that specific calf needs. And so when they describe it, there's no change in number of employees that they need. It's just that those employees don't have to just feed the calves anymore. The calves can, they can focus on cleaning. They can check data to spot check, temperatures and whatever else. So there's just a displacement. And I think that goes for kind of all of the traditional manufacturing businesses that we have around here, where it's not, the question I like to ask anymore is, what does it look like if I come back in 5 years? And no one is talking about fewer employees. No one is talking about anything else. It's like, yeah, more automated, palletizers or more, stuff like that. But it's never, man, we're going to get rid of our employees to replace them. And I think the other thing, just before I stop, the innovation that we had talked about sort of previously on our little huddle was, we have a food processor, which is one of the biggest employers in the county, and they're running 3 school buses. They run a school bus in and out per shift, and they're 3-shift operations. So they're running 6 school buses a day to get employees out to their facility. And I think that's the kind of innovation that we're looking at right now, where it's access to transportation. Of course, for them it pencils because people show up. They don't have people missing work. It's obviously easier for the employees to not have to worry about it. And so they run a couple buses a day outside of Salem. And so I think those are the challenges, I think, when you're in a rural area, of how to get people to work. Obviously, we don't have like robust mass transit by any stretch. And so those are the things that we're thinking about for sure for future work.
It's kind of funny, Tim, because you think about the work you were doing in the Bay Area and how one of the controversial issues going down there years ago was these big tech companies that were running their own semi-transit service, bringing the employees from downtown San Francisco out to their big tech facilities. And here with the same issue going on down with the agricultural world in Salem. Let me ask you the same question, Tim. When we first asked you, and you've had a lot of time to think about this, because I think we asked you about 24 hours ago or so to join this session. But this crossover of mobility and future of work, what sort of immediately jumped to mind with you?
Well, I think that Alex touched on it really well, and we've heard about this for many years. We had a situation where the discussion a few years ago was we're really concerned about how we're shifting in mobility and what that's going to do for jobs. And the concern was that, you know, truck drivers are going to be automated out of work, and that taxi drivers and Uber drivers will be automated out of work, and all these things. And the reality is that, you know, the long arc of this shared electric automated trend, which is what is moving in mobility, is decades long, not days long. So there's going to be plenty of transition opportunity to reskill and retool people along the way. What we're finding though is the reality is that, and Alex touched on it really well, is that we have a gap, and not just in the US, but all over the world, even in some of the, let's just say more developed to the developing countries, where there is really no desire to do these jobs for the generation, the Zoomer generation, this Generation Z. This is not their interest at all. So we're seeing that in 10 years' time, we're going to have a huge gap of people interested in doing the work versus those that are retiring from doing the work. And that gap in between needs to be filled somehow. So we have a lot of barriers that are basically forcing us to really think this through. So that's one area of the future of work, which is interesting, is that the future of the actual labor wanting to actually perform the task, which is why automation is moving so much faster in the agriculture, construction, mining area, because those tasks are actually much more simple to do. And it's actually something that we can do right now. The other area of future of work that I think is very interesting is how we actually are physically working from this point forward. The tragedy of COVID-19 was a wake-up call to managers who are really reticent to allow their staff to work from home, even a day a week. And this forced their hand and said, well, we have to right now. And now that it's been 3 months into this, there's very few managers who say that this doesn't work. You know, they said that it's been working, it's been challenging for sure, but it's definitely something that's basically fast forwarded this idea that we had. Anybody on this chat who has done any transportation demand management or workplace management or real estate siting has known that if we could just get people not to drive, it would make things so much easier for a lot of reasons. And people who have little kids, you know, if they could work from home while the kids are at school, this has been a big problem because they've actually not been at school. So if they can work from home a couple of days a week, it just makes life so much easier. They can do a bunch of different things. So now we're in this weird experiment where we have to stay at home, or we had to. Unfortunately, we couldn't go out, we couldn't do a lot of different things, but we still worked from home. And it actually worked. There were some nuances that we saw, and a lot of our clients that we're working with have found that there's no in-between reaction. There is the group that says, this is the best thing ever, I don't want to go back to the office. And that's a large majority of people. And there's the opposite end, which is, this is the worst thing ever. I can't wait to go back to the office because I live alone. Work for me was actually more social. It was not really about the work. I can always do the work on my own, you know, at a remote location, it's fine, but I want that social connectivity. And then there's this small in-between, which is we do need on-site collaboration. We do need to do some things that it requires to physically be there. But, you know, we have some clients who are in the hard space, the hard infrastructure space, and the engineer is basically at home using telecommunication, and a site worker is using a camera, literally attached to a GoPro attached to onto their helmet, and they're walking them through the circuitry right now. So we're realizing that there's so much more remote work that can be done. It's not just the professional office type stuff. There's many, many other tasks that can be done remotely, as long as we have that connection with each other. And so broadband becomes a big deal. Like, do we have broadband access? And those that do and those that don't. And the digital divide is really the future of work issue. It's, do you have the digital skills to be able to do this kind of interactive work? And then do you actually have the physical infrastructure, the cell phone towers, the fiber optic cable, those two things, the satellite connection, those are really important things. When I worked at Google X, we created these balloons that would float in the atmosphere and create Wi-Fi over rural areas like Peru and Colombia, et cetera, because there's no way the government could actually build the infrastructure through those mountain ranges. It just wasn't possible. The same thing in southern parts of Africa, where there are no roads, there are no airports, but we could actually deliver drone technology to actually help deliver medical supplies. So we have to think of different ways in terms of keeping our economies resilient, while also understanding that the physical work environment, the office, the downtown real estate high-rise office may actually change, and it's changing right now, while working from home becomes not just a thing that's nice, it becomes a critical piece of that. So it raises a lot of questions about our transportation infrastructure. Will we see the congestion that we had last year ever again? Will we see it at the level that we had it? Will we have crowded transit systems again? All these big questions of what's our workplace rules for working from home? What happens if you fall in your house and slip? What's the liability for the environment? Is there ergonomic setup for how are you set up properly so you don't have repetitive stress injuries? All these things now are going to be worked on, and we're really busy on this stuff. So,
Yeah.
I'll leave it there. But yeah, it's a lot of big questions.
Our keynote speaker at the very beginning of the week, our bald futurist, had a couple key points that really stuck with me, and it's been interesting to see how the thread was tied between some of the individual sector keynotes and some of the other sessions. But it was he was calling the entire pandemic experience kind of the great accelerator. A lot of these trends that we had already been seeing happening, and whether it's something as specific as Hertz and car rental companies going out of business, we were watching that train wreck slowly before, were accelerated drastically. And I think if we were going to draw a Venn diagram around this whole thing, and us consultants like to do that a lot, right, Tim? This point about broadband is the other overlapping circle between the mobility and the future work, and all three are just so tied together so closely. And Alex, you mentioned living in independence, and what a great example we've got right here in our state of a rural community. I think between Independence and Monmouth, they're both around 10,000 people. So a thriving metropolis of 20,000 when you combine them. You're probably about 20 minutes out of downtown Salem out there?
15 at most, yep.
Yeah, especially now, right?
Yeah.
And here are a couple communities that got together and built a robust fiber optic network, fiber to the home and all the businesses. And it allows you to live there, and it's going to allow you, as Tim's just talking about, and allow many of the other businesses to work from home and stay as effective and efficient. I think, Tim, I modified a quote that you had when we were prepping, or maybe it was what you said, but like you were talking about the changing culture of work, and the 9 to 5, and the must commute in the morning peak and must commute home in the PM peak, which then has caused the congestion that we've all been experiencing. And so as this future of work changes, adapting to more people, even if people are still going into offices in the future, maybe they're not always doing it in the morning peaks and driving home PM peaks. So it could potentially flatten that curve a little bit that we've always been trying to do as transportation engineers. So I think you called the changing culture of work could change the culture of congestion and commuting. But I want to flip back over to you, Alex, and pick up on this broadband issue, because not only has Independence shown the opportunity, what it has allowed within the service area that they're able to provide versus right outside of that has shown yet again, you can push the digital divide out further, but that doesn't make it go away. And Independence, as great of a success story as it is one of very few success stories in the local broadband. So, Spear, so talk a little bit, if you can, about your perception about how that this entire intersection of broadband mobility and future work, maybe.
Yeah, sure. Could go 400 different ways, I think, in this, because I think it's one of the most talked about. I know I was already in a call this morning with all the county leaders, and the mayor of Fall City couldn't get to the call because his internet was down, because Fall City doesn't really have robust kind of infrastructure when it comes to that. Yeah, so as you touched on, we have municipally owned fiber here in Monmouth and Independence. It's fantastic. The customer service is fantastic. I'll just, as a customer, I'm lucky. But once you get to city limits, right, that stops. So the county, Polk County has actually been pretty innovative when it comes to surveying around broadband needs and desires. And actually there's a really nice report that they put together. They surveyed 5,000 people sort of from outside of the cities. So outside of Monmouth, Dallas, Independence, for so how is your internet and what kind of service, do you have and what do you actually need? And, there's 17 different providers. It's across all sorts, fixed wireless versus satellite, cable, DSL for those folks that have it. But pretty much nobody's happy with kind of the service that they have. And 80% of people, indicated that they used, 88% of respondents said that they use the internet for non-entertainment purposes, right? So a lot of home-based businesses, of course, we are in a predominantly agricultural county. And so the crux of a lot of the ag tech and whatnot and precision agriculture and all that is, of course, access to some sort of internet or, some sort of technology backbone for it to really work. And I mean, we hear stories, and obviously lots of anecdotes, but you hear stories of even the new combines, right? So all the new tech combines, they drive, they're GPS enabled. A lot of times they'll self-drive. They're $500,000 pieces of equipment. They're pretty insane. But if you go into depression in the ground, right, it loses connectivity, and so it will lose sight, or you will lose visibility sort of that combine. And so like, okay, so that's a problem, because if and so just like those kinds of issues come up constantly, plus the fact that any of the precision ag pieces really require some sort of you can build a mesh network, but that's difficult. And of course, in an agricultural environment, a lot of things struggle to survive, year over year and season after season, storm after storm. Plus, I also joke that you might have to survive like 22s, sort of people out shooting bullets at sort of like sort of rural problems. But I think there's no necessary answer to that. I love what Tim is talking about when it's about, thinking about different ways of balloons and stuff like that. But in terms of long-term solutions, and I think plus, of course, the K-12 piece, the digital skilling piece is a really, really important one. And I think the COVID stuff has just really blown, we've known about that divide, but that's really blown it wide open. And so we've been scrambling around here to figure out how to get kids access who are outside of town. Who, how do you access schoolwork, and how do you do that? And of course, and I guess the weird part about a lot of this too is like the USDA has this Reconnect program to, for rural broadband. So there's quite a bit of money actually kicking around. I think we're kind of unique in that we're not rural enough. A lot of that money goes to like frontier kind of towns rather than rural towns, and so rural areas. And so we're too close to Salem, and we have a lot of providers that say that they can provide, XYZ service. But when, push comes to shove, it's like, well, it doesn't pencil for them to run fiber and to run line. And so, or even do set up a fixed wireless setup. And so how do you, there has to be a different solution, or there has to be some sort of, essentially government kind of funded solution, because otherwise, what do you do? So, yeah.
Yeah. There's quite a few different tracks, Tim, for you to potentially.
Yeah. Sorry, all over the place.
Oh, no. I mean, that's what, I mean, if it were easy, we wouldn't even need these conferences, right? We'd be just getting together, celebrating how we solved all the problems. So Tim, there's a few different paths you can riff off from there. It started with kind of this overlapping of the intersection of broadband, the need for that, mobility and future work. Happy to start there, or any of the notes you were jotting as Alex was going down there. How do you want to?
I think the key issue here, I think, is, you know, that we don't have even access across the country, any country. We live in an uneven world with uneven geographies. So those of us who live in urban cores is different from those who live in the suburban areas, the outer suburban rural transitional areas, and then the actual frontier areas that Alex was talking about as well. There really are, there's 4 major or 5 major transitional areas, and each of those have their own unit economics in terms of what's actually available. And we have to think of it from a perspective of, you know, as a person who used to basically brief elected officials and policymakers, you have to try and figure out how to use your limited resources in the most effective and way that reaches the most people. And sometimes it was a public and a private partnership. Sometimes it was a public incentive grant to kick this off. And sometimes you had to do it yourself. And the third one was always one that took the longest because that's the most difficult one to do. But there's always an opportunity where there is a community focused effort on really assessing the different communities that you're working with and understanding what do they actually need, where are they at, and what can we go to the next step and create that improvement. And I think there's a real opportunity to really do the reaching out and asking what's really happening. Many professionals, unfortunately, have an assumption of what the area needs, and they don't actually talk with a broad selection of people to find out what's really happening there. You know, the beauty of this has meant that most of the transport options can actually work, but they couldn't have worked without this. It was not just the smartphone itself, but it was the API interfaces that allowed the apps to happen. It was the Wi-Fi and GPS that allowed the location precision to happen. But it was also the 3G and now 4G wireless, and we may get to 5G, but that's another conversation. But you know, those things are really important background infrastructure pieces that allow this sort of stuff to happen. And if you have black spots or spots that basically don't have coverage, you're out of the system. As much as you want to be part of it, you're out of the system. So having an assessment of where is the community at, what is its base infrastructure, what is its needs, I think is a real opportunity to really start those conversations. And I think it's important to know that it's a challenge to say this, but in a metropolitan area that has 1 million people is a different approach for creating future-proofing their work economic opportunities than a rural area that is 500 square miles that has 2,000 or 3,000 people. There's a very different approach to that. Neither one is more important than the other, but from a policy perspective, there are specific things that need to be tackled. And I think the only way to do that really is to engage deeply in those communities and find out, do they need an extra 2 cell phone towers to basically take care of this situation? Or is it that we need to actually spend more time working on figuring out ways to have free Wi-Fi at these community centers or at these libraries or at the grain stock feed center, because that's where people can actually get their Wi-Fi. You know, we found situations that are rural areas in the United States are not that different from some developing regions across the world in terms of their need for access. And then at the same time, we found that inner city areas or areas that have been traditionally marginalized have the same digital issues that, you know, even rural areas that are way further away in different states. So situations where, when I was with the city, we worked with having free Wi-Fi at libraries and public schools. And the sad truth was that you would find school children with their parents after hours sitting outside the school doing their homework because it's the only place they can get their Wi-Fi, right? So we need to, again, without engaging communities, you're not going to know what the actual opportunities are. And I've always found, and especially with what we do with our company, is we don't know the answer until we ask the right questions and talk to the right folks in the room. But the process to get there is scalable, and we can actually do those processes many times over. It's just that we need to make sure that from the get-go, we've asked the right questions, we have the right people in the room. The traditionally ignored or traditionally marginalized are actually invited in the room to be part of this discussion. And then the how to get to those answers is fairly understood. And then there's a reality check of the answer may not be what you want to hear. but that is the answer. And so now what do we do? How do we work on that answer?
Well, so I was going to pivot into another topic on that has been underlying a lot of what I'm hearing about. So I'll plant a seed because we're going to come back to it in just a quick second. That's around the changing workforce itself. And Alex, this is an area that's going to be, you know, near and dear to your heart. But the point you were just making, Tim, I think is one I don't want to leave just yet, and that is around how we address the equity issue. You know, the other elephant that's been in the room recently, and in the mobility space, and I assume in the future workspace as well. I don't work there as much. I mean, there's so many different issues that we're trying to tackle here, but fundamentally it all comes down to outreach, communication, and making sure that we're actually listening to communities. And I think one of the other things that I know we've done poorly in the transportation planning community is maintaining dialogue with those communities. I think in many cases, we can do a pretty decent upfront job of going out and gathering information. And then we go away and do all of the design and implementation work. And then sometimes we might come back in at the very end and say, how did it work for you? If we even do that. So I think one of the fundamental things is kind of maintaining conversation throughout design, throughout implementation, and in the ongoing use of facilities. Is this actually working for your community? Did we get it? Did we hear you right? And did we get it right? But what are some, it's easy to say. Obviously, if it were easy to do, I think we would have been doing it, but at least if we're more intentional about it, we'll find ways of doing it. What are some quick tips and tricks and things that you've found successful in that space? I'll start with you, Tim, and then come to you, Alex, and then we'll probably shift to the last little bit and talk workforce.
Well, public engagement is actually really easy. It requires you to shift your mindset in terms of not going there as, you know, too much of our public engagement processes is missionary style. We've already got the answer. We just got to go there, talk to people, talk at them, and then tick the box. And so we've done it. Now we can do it our thing. I've actually worked with a lot of people in my career who are so resentful at doing this. And they have to go out there and like, oh my God, it's in the evening. I don't want to do this. I don't want to talk to people. I literally don't want to talk to people. And I can say, why are you in this role? Your role is all about talking with people. We shifted it when I was working in San Francisco, and this is what we do very clearly in our role, is that we actually go out very early and we go out very often, and we do it in very different ways. It's physically, now the world's changed, but before, last year, we'd go out there and physically meet with people on their terms, at their times, in their spaces, go there to learn. And really make it clear that we're actually using our 2 ears and not our mouth. And we're doing a lot of listening and not much speaking. And so we're really wanting to learn and pick up what's happening. The other thing that we did, which was, I think was really interesting, was we created a really big discussion around empathy, having empathy for the customer, having empathy for the representative of the community, and actually spending a couple of times in their shoes. If it was a disability community, actually getting our engineers and planners in wheelchairs and navigating the neighborhood to figure out what does it feel like to be in that environment with those different mobility barriers. We would blindfold certain staff to get them to cross the intersection to see, like, is the audible signal loud enough? We would actually have people use crutches to slow down so they can be like, look, the crosswalk timings are just not too fast for the average person. Those are the kind of things where you develop empathy. We would actually go on bike rides with the Bicycle Coalition and ride streets together and say, how do these feel from a stress level, et cetera. So it was more than just standard engagement and being much more approachable. It was actually going and seeing the world through their eyes. And that was really cheap because that just required us to basically set up times and go out there and do that. Electronically now, because of the situation we have now, using crowdsourcing, sending out information saying, we would love feedback. When we did the bike share program in San Francisco, we said, here is what our model is telling us. Where do you think we should put the bike share locations? And everybody gave feedback. And it basically mirrored the model, which was really affirming to the engineers who really thought they had it from the get-go. But it also helped allow people to feel buy-in, that they were part of the decision-making process. And when people feel that they've been engaged and they're part of the decision-making process, they're much more likely to support the outcome, even if it's not exactly what they wanted, because they are part of this tool. What's been a challenge for what's happening right now in the last couple of weeks is that our transportation planning and engineering profession is very centered around this predominantly male white approach of doing things. And that excludes a lot of different groups, specifically Black and brown and women and people with disabilities, and just generally the other. So to get around that now, it's really about decentering the white male perspective and having a lot more other groups lead these conversations, and then figure out ways, either language, culture, race, etc., bringing those into the very center, and then using the skills that we have and the frameworks that we have to augment those. And that, I'm thinking, is going to be the big change moving forward, and not having that style that we had even last year, to having a different form where the community is being actually allowed for the first time to lead these discussions and lead the effort, and the profession will be supporting, which is a big change.
Yeah, and on that last point, one of the tips that I've been learning and learning from my colleagues that do a lot more of the community outreach is changing the people who are communicating with with the communities to trusted local community-based organizations that already have the trust of that community. There's still this, I'm the government, I'm here to help mentality that we've kind of are getting over. Alex, we've only got a couple minutes. Do you have anything you wanted to add on this particular topic? And then,
yeah, I would just say that from my perspective, that approach is not a novelty, right? So I'm sort of the way that we work and our brand of sort of economic development is show up to pretty much everything, and at least that's my brand for sure. So I mean, I work a lot of evenings. I do a lot of community meetings. I do a lot of sort of any public sessions like I like to go to, and and it's not for me to talk, it's for me to shut up. It's for me to just listen. And the way our approach, I think, to economic development for SEDCOR is sort of industry driven. So it's really a matter of we like to get partners in the room, sort of similar industries or similar sectors, and just listen and ask questions, and let them kind of build a network with each other. But then also sort of we aggregate sort of thinking around that. And for communities, it's much harder to do in communities. I would say, just slight plug for the City of Independence. The City of Independence has been working sort of this community-driven strategy for 30 years. And if you came here 20 years ago, Main Street was not pretty and was not a destination. And the city listened and built a strategy based solely on community input of, tell us what you want, and then we'll build a hit list of projects and whatnot. And now, of course, COVID has derailed some of that, but, there's a beautiful hotel, 75-room boutique hotel right on the river. That was identified in like 1998 as a goal for the city. And it's not like the city built the hotel, but the city absolutely took steps to attract that kind of investment. And they play a high risk, high reward game. Especially for a small 10,000 person city, but those kinds of community driven efforts are the ones that are the most successful and sort of biggest tent. So
yeah. And by doing that on a sustained basis for a long time and showing results and having a constant dialogue, not just a one-time information grab, it's really changed the relationship that I've seen between the citizens and the mayor and the local government. There's a lot more trust built by doing this, but it's earned. And that's the whole thing about trust, right?
Yeah, I would also say that, even just like I do a lot of work in agriculture, and riding around in a combine is probably the best possible way to interact with the farmer, right? Like, hey, he's a captive audience, I'm a captive audience, and like we got plenty of time to kill, especially when you're doing like grass seed or whatever. And I think that's showing up to stuff like that, to me, has been the most impactful. And it also demonstrates, we don't have time to talk about sort of all the rest of the things that we're working on here. But I mean, there's a skepticism and cynicism in agriculture for a lot of farmers towards technology and, you know, whiz bang app and like, this is going to solve your problem, etc. Like, it's not. I mean, so it's really important for, so we're trying to bootstrap, or not bootstrap, but we're trying to work with a group that sort of teaches ag to startups and businesses, right? And a lot of this work came out of the design sprint that we did with TAO a couple months ago around agriculture and technology and ag innovation. And so I think that's the future model. So to build real solutions that are based in real problems in agriculture, and then of course to teach the constraints of what agriculture, because like for me, I didn't come from ag, so it's really important. You know, if I was going to have an ag tech business, if I would have started that 2 years ago and knowing nothing of agriculture, I would have a totally different viewpoint versus like, I don't know, riding around in a combine and like, hey, what are the real problems and stuff like that. So I think that's the piece that I'm a hugely empathetic person, and I think that's the reason I'm probably as successful as I am, just because of that kind of trait.
Well, and you started that off, and then in the middle came back to it too, which is one of the other key points, is go to where they are. If you're really doing community engagement and outreach, it's don't say we're having this thing, this time stamp, you have to come to us, but that time doesn't work for me and I've got to go, you know, and so I think that's a critical element. And you can get a lot of conversation done at 1.6 miles an hour in a combine. So unfortunately, we could go for another half hour. I'm not really going to get into the changing workforce piece that I wanted to, but suffice it to say, everything that I've heard from you, Tim, about the changing workforce and mobility, everything we heard from Maureen Bach yesterday from Oregon DOT and the changing workforce, everything I heard from you, Alex, and the changing workforce in agriculture means that we need a different set of skills that are, and that's going to have to go all the way back into our STEM programs and teaching our kids. I think both of you mentioned that a lot of the challenges are, we've got these jobs that people just honestly don't want to do anymore. And that's why we've either outsourced the labor, brought in other labor, or we're trying to automate those jobs. Somebody has to run the machines. So these systems are not automated. It doesn't really mean what that word implies. So I don't know, Tim, any last thoughts before I got to hand it back over to Technology Association? We got to keep it under like 30 seconds.
Yeah, I think if we keep things interesting, keep things current, and keep people included, it's going to be interesting. Because the job right now, we have in society, you know, our work culture really venerates certain work tasks and doesn't like other certain tasks. And what we found now is that COVID-19 has really emphasized this invisible workforce, which was the gig worker. And now they become essential workers, but they don't have benefits, healthcare, services, etc. Right? So we're going to have to shift and have these honest conversations very soon about what is the real price to move someone from A to B? What's the price to move something from A to B? And what are we willing to pay to have that person move that person or thing from A to B? And we have very different prices for a bus driver, a truck driver, an agricultural driver, and a taxi driver, etc. So we need to figure out how we're going to basically make sure that this is actually a meaningful work that's got dignity. And then more importantly, what is the transition skill set needed as we move away from this manually driven system to an automated driven system? And that's something that we've got time to do, but we need to get those conversations going.
So with that, Alex, sorry, I'm not going to be able to give you a final word on this one. I'm going to have to hand the mic back over to Skip. I want to make sure that our other panel gets their fair share of time. So thank you very much, guys, for joining us. Thank you for everybody for listening.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. This is fun.
Yeah, and thank you, Adrian, Tim, and Alex. We really appreciated it. Great conversation. Next up, we have human factors and economic resiliency. So we'll be continuing with the intersection theme. And to facilitate, we have Dr. Thomas Doherty, who's a psychologist and founder of Sustainable Self. He's been heavily active in a lot of the smart city work here locally as well as nationally as part of one of the supercluster networks. We're really pleased to have him here facilitating the panel. He'll be joined by Jessica Santos, who's the lecturer and scientist at Brandeis Heller School for Social Policy and Management. And then also Carmen Madrid, who's the Business Development Manager at Microenterprise Services of Oregon, also known as MISO. Thomas, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, welcome and thanks everyone and good morning. That was a great talk. I want to thank Timothy, Alex, and Adrian for that talk. I think it sets us up well for this intersection talk that's bringing together some ideas from our human factors track and from the economic resiliency. I mean, in fact, what Timothy, Alex, and Adrian were just talking about was human factors, was resiliency, all the things they talked about, going out and riding a combine with a farmer when you're working with them, being in a wheelchair and navigating the streets to see how that might feel for someone. That is exactly what we talk about in human factors. So I really appreciate that. And just a little background, about 4 years ago, I'd done, as a psychologist, interested in health, public health, environmental issues. I had been working with a tech association and had been presenting on nature and mental health. And I'd met Skip, and he had brought me in to work at the Global Tech Jam, the precursor of this event. And about 3 years ago, we had a panel on health and well-being that led to now a 3-year-long focus on thriving communities. And more recently, we're kind of rebranded as the Human Factors Group. And we've been looking at what makes a thriving community or a smart city, and from 4 directions: from health and well-being across the lifespan, equity and shared prosperity, beneficial connections with nature and the natural world, and vibrant arts and culture. So those have been the 4 legs of our thriving communities stool. And we've been talking about social justice and equity and ethics for years now. So the world has caught up with us a little bit. And so the stuff we're talking about is quite timely. In our human factors track, we've talked about design. That's been a big theme. How do we design products? How do designers take responsibility for their products? How do designers learn ethics? And how do we move that in? We talked about this idea of liberatory design, which is really kind of bringing in an ethics, social justice focus into design, with the idea that injustices are designed into society and we can undesign them. So I think that's going to resonate well with Jessica's message about empowerment economics. And we've also talked about using data to reallocate city budgets, regarding policing and law enforcement. And we did a great talk on that. I encourage you to look at that video, because it's quite complicated. And we had a really gifted data scientist with us helping us navigate some of these questions. And we've talked about corporate social responsibility. We talked about a lot of things. So this is kind of bringing us up together here. We're really pleased to have Jessica here. Jessica is really an expert, a national expert on this idea of zip code and livelihood and zip code and lifespan. And she's going to really lay the groundwork for a lot of the themes that we've been talking about. And Carmen's working here in Portland at Microenterprise Services, a micro lender, and they're really on the ground in North and Northeast Portland doing the work here with communities that have been changing due to gentrification and things like that. So it's really concrete. And so I have 2 sisters with me on this presentation. Jessica is literally a sister of mine. She's actually my sister-in-law, just full disclosure. And her and I have talked about these topics for a number of years. So I'm so glad that she's able to join us. And I'll have Jessica and Carmen talk a little bit about their backgrounds here when they speak. So I'm going to have Jessica start us off, spend about 15 minutes. She's got some slides she's going to share, talk about her research and her work. And I think that'll set up Carmen to follow up and talk about her work in Portland. And then please do use the chat function. I'll be tracking that. If you have questions or comments, I can try to weave them in. And then we have an hour, and so we'll move diligently through the hour and save some time for larger dialogue at the end. So welcome to Jessica. I think I can see you, and I think hopefully we can hear you. And I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Thomas. Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Great. Good morning. I'm really pleased to be a part of this panel. Like Thomas said, he and I have had the opportunity to just talk about our intellectual shared interests for many years and have collaborated on a few professional projects. And over the last couple of years, my work at the Institute on Assets and Social Policy at Brandeis has begun to overlap more and more with some of the place-based economic development work that I'm learning about in Oregon. So like Thomas said, I'm a researcher. I'm the director of community engaged research at our research institute, and I teach in the master's and PhD programs at the Heller School for Social Policy and Management, where mostly our research institute has been kind of one of the national experts on the racial wealth gap historically, pointing out the differences between, income and wealth and the disparities in communities. Now, and for my own research, I've consistently felt like I needed to move beyond this documenting disparities conversation that tends to happen and move beyond it and say, okay, what are we doing about it? What are some of the policy level ground up solutions that we can be experimenting with, testing, innovating on the ground, moving forward for racial and economic justice. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to just share a little bit of data and then move beyond the documenting disparities into moving forward into the future. I wanted to just get a show of hands to get a sense of who's on the screen here, and I think I am actually going to stop my sharing so that I can see. So there's a little feature that allows you to raise your hand. If you go down to the bottom of your screen and you see reactions, if you press on that, there's like a thumbs up and there's a clap. So I'm going to ask you to put a thumbs up in the screen if most of your life and work is based in Oregon. Okay, great. And are others doing place-based work, like community level work in other parts of the country? Small level place-based, potentially anywhere. Okay. And then what about others doing national level work? Okay, we have a mix. And then one more question, if you are coming at this from a tech perspective, whatever that means to you, thumbs up from a tech perspective. Okay, a few. All right, thank you for that. I appreciate it. And, I wanted to say going forward that, the context that we're all living in right now is so incredibly vulnerable, and we're talking about safety, safety of individuals' lives and entire communities. And I'm going to be presenting on economic and racial injustices and justices. But moving forward, and often we talk about economic resiliency and upward mobility, but I wanted to just remind us all that before any of that, we have to protect each other, care for each other, look around each other, and be in relationships, interconnected ways that are challenging the underlying inequities that we seek to improve. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that as well. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. So Thomas, if you can give me a 1-minute warning, I would really appreciate it. So I'm going to start by just bringing up one, kind of data slide. This is national data looking at the racial wealth gap, which is the difference between median white wealth and median black wealth on the left-hand side, about 10 times. And then on the right-hand side, we have median wealth in white families versus in Hispanic families. Again, this is national. A couple of points here. We see it's incredibly vast, the inequities that we have in our society. It's persistent. Over time, it's getting worse. There are a couple of dips that are the recessions, and we'll see some of similar effects, I expect, post-COVID. But when we think about resources, and I think about resources a lot, not just money, but resources, wealth, who owns it? Who distributes it? Who has the power to determine what happens with that wealth? This is just one angle of inequity. looking at money, looking at resources. Income in Oregon, I was checking out, to what extent are these stats available at the state and, local level in Oregon. It seems that, it sort of mirrors the national level. These inequities do vary by place. And so one really important point that I would like everyone to take away from this is, even though you may know, yeah, we have inequities in our society. Yes, it's economic. Yes, it's racial. Until you really can dig down from a place-based perspective and do an analysis of how those inequities are, to the extent to which they exist in your community and in your organizations, and the mechanisms that are driving those inequities, then we can start having conversations about solutions. So if you look at one of these graphs, I would like everyone to use the chat feature, and I'm going to stop sharing again for a minute. So go into the chat and chat to me, to everybody, chat openly to everybody. What are some of the drivers of that graph being so unequal? Access. Great, what else? Education. Lack of financial education. Education, medical access. Cronyism, nice. No generational wealth, yes. Okay, all right. What else? Others, I'll leave it open and people can share ideas. Stereotypes. Okay, so I'm gonna add to that a couple of broad relationship policies. There it is. Some of the historical context. I'd like you to think back a couple, 1619, right? Before that, the theft of land from Native Americans, the exploitation of labor in communities of color, whether through slavery or continued exploitation in low quality jobs. The fact that our tax base drives the educational inequities in our communities. The fact that I bet if you grew up in the United States and you think about the town that you grew up in, you can probably name the school district that was for the wealthy kids. How many people you knew may have moved to that district just to get ahead, just to give their kids, maybe you've done it, right? Give your kids a little bit of a leg up. So we inherently know how our communities are structured. We know how these inequities operate. But then what happens is when we start thinking about solutions, we start thinking at the individual level. We start thinking about, the white graph looks like this because white families or individuals may have higher levels of education. The black graph looks like this because they may have lower levels of education. So I'd like to disrupt that train of thought right away and suggest that we have much broader historical and structural reasons why we see these racialized wealth inequalities. So what we're looking at here is the intersection between economic and racial injustices that are the foundation of this country. And I am talking specifically United States. Of course, there's a global dimension. But so we can look at any snapshot of data, educational data, health data. We can look, actually, I'll show you, I'll advance all the way to the end and show you the COVID data for Oregon. Everyone take a glance at this slide. This comes to us courtesy of the Coalition of Communities of Color in Portland and their analysis of the disparities in COVID cases by race and ethnicity. And what you will see is kind of similar to what we're seeing in other parts of the country, a disproportionate overrepresentation of COVID cases, especially in the Hispanic population, right? We also see nationally the neighborhoods that are getting hit hardest by COVID are neighborhoods in communities of color. Why is that? You can have an individualistic explanation. Okay, maybe people are not aware of it. Maybe people are still going to work. Or you can have a structural explanation. We have overcrowding and we have residential segregation. People are living in houses closer together. People are still going to work because communities of color are disproportionately overrepresented in low-wage jobs, in the essential workforce, et cetera, do not necessarily have the privilege to be able to work from home, et cetera. So, and our policies support or mitigate these disparities. And so recently I was looking at the numbers, you know, we've had over 125,000 deaths from COVID in this country. If our government had acted just 2 weeks sooner, we could have saved 35,000 people. So policy matters. We're talking about survival. We're talking about disproportionate effects of the same policies on communities that by race. And so another example I'd like to show for Oregon is this. So a lot of our research looks at those mobility, you know, mechanisms. How do we think people get ahead in society? We would like to believe that we get ahead by working hard, getting more education, saving in a bank, and maybe starting a business. But what we have found is that the payoff for the same actions differs substantially for people by race, and that is because of those underlying historical and structural and policy-driven inequities. So this is just one example of, you know, for business ownership, this is just the, you know, kind of annual receipts per firm by race and ethnicity in Oregon. What we would like to see, so I see data like this as evidence of inequities. If we were to see equity, we would see business ownership producing similar amounts of wealth across racial and ethnic communities. I would like to draw those of you who are familiar with Portland, your attention to this map. Can anyone tell me sort of the neighborhood that is in that dark red area?
Yeah, that's, you know, traditionally North Portland.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, over by MLK and historically Black neighborhood. And so, you know, residential segregation exists all over the United States. It differs by city and town. Understanding the dimensions of it in your own community is critical for changing, for solving these inequities. And so if you look at the, you know, the same part of the city and about the same kind of an overlay of household income for children by tract, you'll see that as you get into the orange and reds, we're talking about families that live below 38 or 40,000 in household income and this is for kids. Just an example of how economic and racial inequities correlate right here in Portland. So before moving on to what are we going to do about it, let's move beyond documenting disparities. I want to say a few more things. And one is that our systems have been set up in a way that are artificially separate. And so what we do is we often look at health data, like that COVID slide, and then we look at education data, or we look at residential data or income data. What we'd like to be able to do going forward, and what I think is one of the really necessary pieces of, you know, equitable community development going forward, is understanding how these puzzle pieces all fit together within a specific place-based community, and then flipping the script and truly figuring out what are the assets, what are the non-financial and financial assets that exist within communities of color, centering that entire perspective and having everybody else who has historically built up that wealth and benefited from the same systems to step back. So that's what empowerment economics really is and what it looks like. I'll talk a little bit more about.
Yeah, and Jessica, if you could do about 5 more minutes on the empowerment and maybe share your experiences in Hawaii, and then we'll bring Carmen in.
That sounds great. Oh, and Carmen, I wanted to say, and to those on the phone, I've had the opportunity to engage a little bit with Meso through Jatan Hall, who is one of the staff members there. And I know and for those who are familiar with neighborhood partnerships as an organization, you know, we presented together last fall at their conference, and I just think there's incredible work going on in Portland. So I'm excited to hear more from you, Carmen.
Great, thank you.
So empowerment economics is an idea and a name for a practice that originated in Hawaii, in the Native Hawaiian community. Women who were facing eviction and homelessness and seeing the effects of, you know, kind of the historical and racialized patterns of exploitation on the islands of Hawaii that are pretty extreme, even compared to many other parts of the continent. They basically said, okay, there's this structure set up for housing in Hawaii that is available to Native Hawaiians. There's an entire administration that's supposed to be running it, and we are not getting access. There were lists, and families were on the list for their entire life. They were dying on the list without having housing. And so these women came together and they were like, we do not want to form a nonprofit. We are not in the business of social service. One was a travel agent, and one was a teacher. They came together and they formed a nonprofit, became unbelievable experts in housing and navigating the entire housing system in Hawaii, found out what the barriers were, and then educated a bunch of families on financial capability, right? And got their credit built up and got their paperwork together. And then at the next meeting where the Department of Hawaiian Homelands, DHHL, was set to kind of read out the list and dole out the houses, they had 30 people standing in line with their, you know, their applications ready and housed. And so this story, and this is Hawaiian Community Assets, that's the name of the organization. I've partnered with them for about 4 years and also with the National Coalition for Asian American Pacific Community Development National Capacity, which is a national sort of policy and advocacy organization for API communities. And so I've been working as a research partner in that 3-way organizational partnership to understand what was so unique about the model that HCA had that allowed them to both navigate the system and work with families in a way that had pretty incredible outcomes. So I had that really incredible opportunity of doing, you know, kind of field work in Hawaii and understanding this model. And basically we ended up with a name called Empowerment Economics to distinguish it between anything that is at the individualistic perspective and really broaden the lens towards a systemic view of change going forward. So empowerment economics, it's a multi-generational, culturally responsive approach to building wealth and power simultaneously. And so what we often see in the community development assets fields are programs, and even if they're embedded in communities and led by people who grew up and, you know, kind of know how it all works, it's still that individualistic mindset. Just learn how to save, you know, get another degree, start a business, and you will succeed, right? That's the narrative. We all want to believe that. The problem is that's not true. For some people it works, but others, it doesn't work for everyone. That's not going to get us towards equity. What we really need to be doing is in solidarity working to disrupt those underlying
Could you show your slide?
inequality.
Could you show your slide that differentiates empowerment and traditional approaches?
Yes, I can. So yeah, this traditional financial capability approach is really about individual focused strategies. often these strategies are led by mainstream financial institutions like banks, and they're embedded in the cultural norms and assumptions that we have in the US that I was just describing about this meritocracy that we live in. And then the outcomes that we track in many of these programs are very individualistic. Did people learn how to save? Did they gain some knowledge? Did they actually access an asset? And did they change their attitudes about, about the financial system? In contrast, empowerment economics is really looking at the approach as a social justice orientation. You start the conversation knowing that our system is not set up for families to succeed, for families at the margins. They are at the margins by design. And so empowerment economics requires a redesign of that system. How that looks is different in every community, but the outcomes that we've developed and sort of co-developed through a multi-year research process with 13 API-led organizations around the country are multidimensional. So there's 6 domains. I'll show you in this slide. It's, you know, in addition to the financial capability and wealth, we're looking at, are people generating new narratives about poverty and inequality and wealth? Is the power shifting within the community towards self-determination? Are people becoming more connected across generations and connected to culture, whether it is a culture of origin or whether people are developing a new kind of multicultural way of addressing issues in their community? And then well-being. And these 6 domains kind of map onto a multi-level framework where the impact is not just at the individual level or family level, but it's impacting communities and systems going forward. So I will end there.
Perfect. This is a perfect segue, Jessica, and we can bring you back in. But Carmen, I appreciate your patience. I wanted to get some of these tools and concepts on the table because I think it lays a groundwork for you coming in and describing your approach. So if that's okay, I'll turn it over to you. Thanks, Jessica.
Okay, thank you, everyone. So Nita Shah, our executive director, was supposed to be at this call, but she basically said, could you cover for me? She's not well at this moment. So thank you for having me here. And Jessica, thank you for laying out that incredible framework. I think it is important for people to understand the landscape and the, you know, really the social injustices that are happening in the landscape before you could really understand what's happening and why the folks on the ground are doing what they're doing today. So just to kind of set the stage for those of you that don't know me, so I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen and then just kind of walk you through some introductory screens and then really talk to you about the framework in terms of how we work with our clients. At this time, let me go ahead and get that going here. Okay. Let's see if I can. Okay, so, you know, we basically have a strategic framework and, you know, quite honestly, we just do the work that we do, the way that we know how. And then we had to kind of put it in a way that makes sense and why there's a strong impact in the community of what we're doing. And, you know, it's always trying to identify why is this working so well? And then kind of, you know, talking about that and working through those dimensions. So in a nutshell, MISO's mission is really to improve the economic opportunities to underserved individuals and primarily marginalized communities, people of color, immigrants and refugees, African-American communities. And these are our 3 basically elements of what we work with, and empowerment is first. We have education in there and entrepreneurship, and really at the end of the day, it is to benefit the greater community and to create generational wealth. You know, I resonate with a lot of the facts that Jessica's talking about and how, you know, I came here in this country as an immigrant when there was, you know, military martial law that happened in the Philippines. And so my parents needed to get out and they came here and there's like, it's a great opportunity here. My father had a professional background and he advanced as far as he could. But we know that there were certain determinants that kept him away from moving into a wealthier place, you know, and all that kind of stuff. But he did move us into the suburbs, and you know, and that was intentional. And it was because of the schools. He wanted to surround us with people that had quote unquote more than us, at least in material sense. And so, you know, that is really a sense of privilege that I had that a lot of people did not have. And so when you talk about zip codes and social determinants of health, I actually come from a healthcare background, and, you know, kind of weaving all these pieces together is really, really important. And so what I'm going to focus on today is a little bit more about, you know, the economic development part of it, in terms of economic stability and the community and social context of how important that piece is in weaving this together. So, you know, entrepreneurship, it is a universal poverty alleviation. You know, you go to any country in the world, you know, people can just actually open a store right in front of their house. There's no permits, there's no fees. You know, maybe you own the place, maybe you'll pay a little bit to the person who lives there. You know, those policies that Jessica was talking about, you know, there aren't so many of, you know, restrictions in other places, except here. And so what we're trying to do is we're leveling the playing field. And so that brings empowerment. It basically says, go ahead and do your thing. Go ahead and do what you love best. And it enables that self-sufficiency, it preserves our dignity, and it creates prosperity. You know, here's a few pictures of some clients that we work with, and most of them decided to go on their own because they weren't getting jobs. If they did get jobs, they were discriminated against, and so their dreams weren't being fully fulfilled. And that's why entrepreneurship is really almost like a freedom path to economic growth. But with that said, it's also not necessarily a level playing field. The access to resources aren't always there for everyone. I have a food truck vendor that tried to get a license, you know, and they really couldn't understand her. There weren't resources to help move her along. And then I had another client, you know, that had more English language sufficiency and got it like within, you know, 2 weeks. So just in that alone, you know, a person can actually sit there and, you know, be discouraged to move forward, and their, you know, their empowerment factor gets lost. So, you know, with MISO, you know, our 15 years of history as a nonprofit, I think it's really this trust in communities that we've been able to create this sustainable impact. Our resources are very down to earth. You know, we help clients gain their financial stability, creating wealth for themselves, you know, through savings, loans, and entrepreneurial endeavors. And really, sometimes it's as simple as, do you know what your credit score is? Because we don't have financial education in this country. We don't learn it. Even, you know, my kids went through college, and till now, you know, I ask them, like, do you know what your credit score is? And, you know, that information comes through generational knowledge as well. So, you know, MISO's impact, you know, extends beyond the business know-how. It's not just about, let me see your cash flow. Are you registered with the state? It's really about working with someone so that they have personal agency and they have resilience, and that it's okay. I mean, I had not too long ago, probably 2 years ago, I had an African-American man that came in, and I could feel the wall just to any institution, walking into a place and asking for assistance. He literally told me, I drove around 5 times around this block before I told myself that to come in. So imagine, you know, and that's because of past experiences that he's had, negative past experiences. And so he went in there, and I said, well, I'm gonna be here with you along the way. And, you know, and now he actually owns his building. I mean, it's that story. You know, or I have another woman who, you know, she got laid off from her tech job. She has these amazing technical skills. And then she walked into me, so she was homeless at the time. And I said, what do we need to do to get you back there? She had the solution. She just didn't have the support, and she didn't have the resources. And now she's fully employed, and she has her own business on the side. So that's what we talk about. Empowerment is really seeing people, really seeing their dreams, and then giving them the tools and resources to make it happen. You know, MISO's work is really aimed to create intergenerational impact to our communities and uplifting the isolation and that financial stability. You know, many of our clients, one of the measures that we actually track is how many of you have homes now because you even know how to buy a home. You know, I have people saying, oh, these realtors keep telling me that I don't qualify. And I basically, I talked to a couple of them not too long ago, and I said, it's not a realtor's job to tell you whether you're qualified or not. Let me give you some resources. And that right there, that's enough of a barrier to say, we don't qualify. I'm just going to live in an apartment forever. Sense of shame. You kind of keep it to yourself. And so really it's building that trust so that we can have these conversations, so that we can help move people forward. So, this is really, really what MISO is all about. This is our ladder of impact, and really our theory of change is really sort of focusing on the individual, like we talked about. We're looking at their entire community. It's like, what are the things that we can help you with so that you have financial stability and you have resilience, and then helping them build who their support system is. Who's this bank that you're going to be able to go to, and they're not going to say, you know what, you smell greasy, why are you even here? That was an experience with actually one of our clients who actually revenues over $5 million in his restaurant, and he's hardworking, he's busy. He went in to drop off a ton of cash, and they questioned him on where that cash came from. Since then, after he spoke to me, he has switched his lending institution. So, there are actions that people can take against, some of these barriers. And anyway, sorry, can get kind of emotional. And then last but not least, society. How do we continue to enrich our communities, reduce isolation, and uplift that intergenerational poverty? And so this is the work that we're doing, is taking a look at it and then what the impact is. Now, how do we do this? And I've touched on this pretty much earlier, is that empowerment piece is huge. I mean, if you can't get out of your bed in the morning, if you can't feed your kids and have your basic needs, I mean, this is kind of like Maslow's hierarchy in some way. If you don't have that for yourself, you're not going to be actually able to. How do you attend a class? How do you learn about credit building and a cash flow when you're thinking about, oh, I can't make my car payment or my utility payment? And so, this is what we build on. This is the trust building. The other thing that we do is that our staff, we have over 9 languages, and we are the people that we serve. All of us have actually side businesses, so it's very relatable. And so this is the work that we do so that we, and we learn together. We actually don't have like this sort of mentor model where it's like, I know more than you. Actually, I learn a lot from my clients. They school me all the time. And I think that that's really important to say, look, this is how we build our interconnectedness as communities, is that we're learning from each other. And there's enough trust in that conversation that you can have that open dialogue. I mean, I have clients saying, Carmen, that wasn't really cool how you said that, or, it kind of triggered me this way, that kind of thing. And then I can have that dialogue with them too. So, when you have that trust, that empowerment building, people can move forward in the knowledge of, the basic things that they need to know, marketing, sales, all of the academic stuff. And then that's when you get the real results happening. So, yeah, so that's what it is. And at the end of the day, it's preserving dignity. It's really the person first. When I first started at MISO, I was like, I'm very kind of calculated and, step by step and process oriented. And then I learned, what? It's not about that. It's like, look at that person, look at what that person first, and then see what programs fit them. And if that program doesn't fit them, make it fit them. Do what it takes to get them to qualify. Do what it takes to, which means that, what, I need to sit next to you and do your cash flow with you. I'll do that. And then next thing you know, they're telling me that I've done it wrong, so it's just really awesome. Environment and interactions are organic, friendly, and accessible. We have an open door policy, open layout for the office, open for business in critical times. So I'll just tell you, during COVID, the minute that we were told to go home, the next week, the focus was call every single one of your clients right now and ask them what they need. We've moved over probably 50 businesses on a digital platform during that time. We've contracted clients to shift their businesses so that they can have revenue coming into their doors. Like, for example, a lot of our seamstresses and fashion designers, we contracted them with all of the people that are doing masks. All of our lovely lotion makers and stuff like that, they're all making sanitizers right now, but the revenue is coming in. So, you know, we are working with them hand in hand so that they can feel like they're supported, and they wouldn't have known about these contracts, you know, if we hadn't shifted them in those directions and those conversations. So, you know, we have a personal contact. We're not necessarily technologized. I do have to say, we have taught everybody how to use Zoom. So that's been pretty cool, you know, that kind of thing. And some of our clients are like, oh, I could use this for dating. And I'm like, well, just be careful, you can get recorded. So, you know, anyway, we have a good time with our clients. And I think that's part of the success also, is like, we are like a family and there is that trust building. This is Nikisa. I just wanted to show you a quick example of one of our clients. And she also started, you know, really from, you know, from nothing. She had a thought, she had a concept and an idea. She actually cornered a certain part of the market to do healthy meals for sex workers, because they're often ignored. They're a marginalized community. Like within 2 months, she was in like the New York Times. I mean, she was, you know, she's all over. If you look her up, it's pretty amazing. And here's the one thing that all we had to do. She sat in there one time with me and I said, okay, where are you at with your business? And she said, well, Carmen, I registered my business. I got my EIN number. You know, I got everything done. And then I said, oh, okay, how much have you sold? And then she said, oh, I haven't sold anything yet. And I'm like, oh, okay, well, this meeting's over. What's the goal for next week? How much you selling this weekend? She's like, what? And there was this moment, because that's where the fear was, right? Like, she's never done this before. And so what happened was I said, sell 2 dishes, I'll buy one. You'll meet your goal by Monday. And she's like, oh, I could probably sell more than 2. And I'm like, okay, 5. And then so she came back Monday, and then now she's doing catering jobs with the county and the city, and it's just amazing, you know. So, and she's a businesswoman. Every time I sit down with her now, I'm just like, what's your cash flow? And she's like, well, these are what my projections look like now. Like, the words are there now, you know, but it had to start from that empowerment. So, you know, this is really one of so many stories. We do have a loan program because we do feel that people do need to learn how to apply for loans, especially when their businesses grow. You know, really the loan program has 2 major roles. It's to fulfill MISO's impact. We want to teach people how to get access to funding, to resources. We want them to be able to go into a bank and say, that interest rate is too high, I'm going to go somewhere else. You know, it's really that sense of like confidence and empowerment and education to move in that direction. And of course, you know, this sustains MISO in our financial stability too. So our default rate is less than 2%. And people say, oh, well, that's because you're lending out $250. And I'm like, you know how hard it is to collect that when someone, when someone hasn't ever had traditional lending before. But it's amazing what that does for their credit score when they complete the program and they get the education along with it. And the technical assistance, you know, to say, okay, what can we do here right now that you're struggling? So that's our loan program. This is an impact chart that we measured against some of our other peers that are doing similar work. And, you know, really, if you look at it, this is personal transformation will lead to all of these business results. I mean, that's really how we feel, is that, you know, the confidence, the self-efficacy, their self-worth, sense of connection, this is where people are at. They're like, before MISO, I didn't even know these things. And, you know, that same African-American man that I was telling you about, he actually started crying in front of me, not crying like boohoo, like just teary-eyed. And he basically said, Carmen, I wish I knew this, but now I can pass it on to my kids. Mm-hmm. And you're going to teach me how to buy a house, right? You know, so, you know, very, very, you know, strong work that delivers impact. This is one of those like word things. So you can see how friendship is big there. So that's pretty much it. And unless, you know, open it up for questions.
Yeah, thanks so much, Carmen. That was great. And we really, just both of you, very great talks. you know, really wanted to run them with these slides and give some content for our attendees. But let's open it up. Please use the chat if you have some specific observations or questions or a program that you're working on you want to share. But Jessica and Carmen, I mean, Jessica, you have some thoughts or reactions after listening to Carmen and how this dovetails with what you're doing?
Yeah, sure. If there are no other immediate thoughts or questions, I really admire the work of, MISO, and it definitely aligns with everything that we've been seeing in the field. I think one of the things that, for me, I struggle with just from an academic, kind of platform perspective, is that we have this thing and it has a name, right? But it really is what communities have been doing forever. And it's not a new idea, right? It's really what people are, like, communities have the solutions and need the resources. So I think, I don't know, I'm curious to hear from others on the call, like, what I believe that, like, the redistribution of resources and power is what we need to be working towards, right? And so MISO's work with families allows people to have that, kind of step onto a rung of a ladder, but so many people don't have that. And so how can we work from an even bigger perspective on some of those underlying policies, so that we're not just working towards individual mobility, but we're working towards collective, community wealth and that interconnectedness that we both spoke about. And from, since this is a smart cities and a tech-oriented, conversation, I'd love thoughts about how this resonates with the smart cities model, et cetera.
This is great. Yeah. And I see, yeah, if I was going to see if Skip was on the call, he might have some, he might be aware of things that are happening right now, tech-wise. I see Adrian. Adrian, if you want to, I can unmute you, and you can, if you want to verbally do your, yeah, if you want to just give your question out, go ahead.
Yeah, I just, like everybody else probably is spending too much time on social media and occasionally too much time watching the news. It just feels like this bad news piling on bad news, and or some of the good news that's come out of, especially the protests and the equity conversation. At least we're having conversations, and so there's been the ray of the good news that I've seen in that is that a lot more people are talking about things that we've had heads buried in sand for, ever. The kinds of programs and the work that you guys are doing, are you feeling optimistic that this is early stages of some programs and direction that can increasingly get mainstreamed and not just be kind of these little success stories here and there and academic discussion here that's not working its way into processes that we're all using? What give me some hope.
Yeah.
Well, I can give you a little bit, Adrian. So, when COVID hit, all of these federal resources came down, and it was, people were recognizing that communities of color and marginalized communities did not have access to these resources, the funding and the grants and the loans and all that kind of stuff. And so that's when the state and other agencies started seeking organizations like ours. And so honestly, during this time, from an organizational standpoint, we've expanded. I mean, we're actually rolling out a Clackamas County grant on Monday. And, I don't think maybe they would have eventually worked with us, but because of, they know what our focus is, and then maybe they're going to start to take a look at, well, why is that working? Why is that working over there? And what can we do to either continue to support this model or, educate our own leaders on how we need to shift some of the policies and, maybe it's, reducing, some of the fees for folks for now, and identifying what that means. And so, like even with MISO, when COVID happened, we said we need to shift. We need to shift so that people can continue to have access to us. And so that's some of the things that I think is happening right now is the visibility of how important this work is and how so many people are being left behind. And honestly, if communities of color are left behind, the whole community is left behind, unless we can come together and, you know, put some policies around all of this.
Yeah, I would echo everything you said, Carmen, and I agree that if the extent of inequality that we have in our society harms us all, and the consciousness that we're seeing nationally around both racial and economic inequities right now I'm very hopeful. I feel like I'm living, we are living through another kind of iteration of civil rights movement right now. And we need to capture that momentum in the way that Carmen described. People have been always doing this work. So, you know, this is a movement already, whether people in power, whether, you know, white people or institutions are aware of it is one thing. It's happening on the ground. What we need to do is just honestly divert resources and power and to those movements that are happening on the ground. And I do believe this is a moment when that it is already happening. I do a little bit of work in philanthropy, organizing funders to try to understand all of this stuff and to divert some of their resources and look at different metrics that aren't so individualistic. And they're very supportive of all of this. So I personally know that I'm talking to people all over the country, and I would say this resonates very widely.
Hey, Thomas, I came in, I think, at the tail end of the question is I was stepping out for a quick bio break. I'm like, what are the chances that they call on me specifically as they're still talking? Of course, Murphy's Law on a Friday, right?
Yeah.
So I caught the tail end of it, which was, I think, the connection between smart cities and the descriptions that had just preceded that around, like, there's some really interesting, potentially hopeful work going on and some great, you know, results, some interesting case studies. And to Adrian's point about, like, okay, how do we seize this moment and sustain this ongoing and also achieve the scale that's necessary? And I think scale to me is usually comprised of like a handful of different component parts. Like funding is a big piece, and I think Carmen mentioned, you know, some of the federal stimulus money. There could be some opportunities there, but there was also a lot of diversion and not necessarily the best targeting of that money to those who need it most. And so it was also very rushed. And I mean, in some cases well-intentioned, but rushed, and it can be sloppy when something's rushed. And so, you know, thinking beyond the federal stimulus dollars, where are the sources of funding going to come from to kind of scale up the success that is happening? And then how do we have the systems in place that maintain that scale that's necessary to serve the greatest number of people over time? So funding's a piece of it. And then I also think about technology. You know, a lot of times access is about reaching people where they are. And right now we're in this situation where a lot of people are, you know, remote. They're in their homes, residences, whatever. And I think government's struggling with this, businesses are. It's about, to Adrian's point earlier this morning, how do you reach people where they are? And I think there's some opportunities, given the ubiquity of technology, to think about where there are digital divides, how do we bridge those, and how do we get more tech more efficiently into the hands of people so that they can get access to education services, economic opportunity, health services, which are increasingly being delivered virtually. So those are some of the things that I'm seeing. And more specifically, you know, you see the rise in telehealth, telemedicine efforts and investments in rural, as well as underserved communities when it comes to broadband and wireless infrastructure. There's interest as well in looking at different ways that, you know, startup activity can be fostered and supported in a variety of different sectors. How do folks get access to more tech-oriented opportunities in that way? Anyway, those are some thoughts around that particular question, assuming that was the question.
Yeah, I know, Skip, you're just aware of things happening, and I just wanted to make sure we heard from you because there is a lot going on. You just sent a message out this morning about a federal grant program. Mm-hmm. Is that something that is there a window in there or some lever or wedge where we can, you know, insert this equity lens, do you think?
I do. I know the city of Portland has been looking at that opportunity from a grant standpoint, and they're very much focused on any application or proposal would be through an equity lens. And Portland State University is also looking at it, and with John Fink and some of his work with the digital test bed, it's really about access. Fundamentally, a lot of their project work, including access to mobility solutions and the like. And so I think there is an opportunity for this region in that regard for sure. And to Carmen's point, I mean, here again, our cases can be strengthened the more community-based organizations that are a part of any proposal. Because one big issue we have right now is a disconnect. We're seeing gaps between connections between government on the one hand and the residents they serve on the other. And organizations like MISO are the bridge. And so government can only be as attuned and as effective in meeting the needs of its residents as organizations like MISO have the funding and the scale they need to do what they do.
And I just wanted to add to that, MISO's only 14 people, but counties are coming us to distribute this information because of our community connections and the trust building that's already embedded in our organization. And, you know, while we do serve as a bridge, I do think it's important to acknowledge that when these strategies and policies are in place, that the voice of the small business owner, you know, the MISOs of the world are present in that conversation. Because too often what I do see is that a model is created that's not even suitable for the way it's intended to be. So those initial, I mean, you can talk about anything, right? Like food planning, you could talk about transportation, you know, all of these things. You know, if there isn't an equitable participation in that process, then we're back to square one. So, yeah.
I placed a link in the chat, the Civic Innovation Challenge. That's this big federal funding program that's coming on, and it's being enhanced around COVID, and it might be something to look into. I think there was like a micro business version of that, or some sort of way for some of these to break through that durable inequality, the structural ceiling to get folks in there. Yeah.
I think the only other thought I have that I wanted to share is that sometimes these things, we're talking pretty big picture, big ideas right now, but sometimes this stuff can be close to home and like can actually be easier than it feels. Like in your own relationships and your own organizations, how are you facilitating racial and economic justice just within the literal day-to-day interactions? You know, I really appreciate that somebody wrote cronyism in relationships, because it's like the hoarding, opportunity hoarding is what, you know, the sociologist Charles Tilly calls it. But we know that one of the reasons why we have the perpetuation of all of those historical inequalities is because once people accumulate privilege, they hoard it and then they pass it on to their own families or friends or people that look like them, right? And so in what ways are you truly disrupting those patterns in all of your decision making, in all of your transactions? And what Carmen just said about the process, I would say, is huge. You know, when we talk about redistributing power, that's what it looks like, is having me so paid to, you know, lead the thinking on whatever proposal's going in and gather a table together. But so often we see people just being asked to do that for free because they happen to be embedded in community, right? And so I don't know, just really literally small things can make a big difference in terms of shifting those power and resource, like changing that equation up in day-to-day work.
That's great. Well, I noticed we're at 11 o'clock, and I think we need to switch to the town hall function of this. And I think people are I'm going to turn it over to Skip, but I think people are welcome to stay in the discussion here, and just kind of try to wrap up the whole of the Techlandia week. But I want to thank Jessica and Carmen. This is an excellent talk, and you know, this video will be available, and so this talk will live on, which I think is really one of the benefits of Zoom, that it will be, and more people will be able to see this. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Great. Thank you for having us.
Yes, and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carmen and Jessica and Thomas as well. That was a great discussion.
Thank you.
So as Thomas mentioned, we will be shifting to a more interactive town hall format. And so we encourage folks, we've got, I think, enough space bandwidth-wise to accommodate people if they want to pop up in video. Feel free to do so. We want to treat this as sort of a virtual roundtable, if you will. So we've got a couple of people who are interested in sharing some of their thoughts and some project ideas coming out of the week's worth of programming. And we have Scott Sorensen, who's the Director of IT at Holt International in Eugene, who's one of the people who's going to be sharing some information and thoughts with us. We also have Charmaine, who's the Director of Marketing and Business Development at Supply. And then Kara Snow, who just popped up at the bottom of the screen, who's with TAO. And Kara has been leading much of the design sprint efforts this past week. And so I thought it'd be good to have Kara maybe do a quick little highlight reel of some of the stuff that came out of the design sprint, which is, I think, really interesting. I mean, there were 7 projects. And then at the end, once we've had Kara, Charmaine, and then Scott share their thoughts, myself, Thomas, and Adrian can do a little bit of a recap of what we saw coming out of each of the remaining micro summits. And then, of course, we'll have an open chance for people to also pop up. If you didn't register to speak or whatever ahead of time, no worries. We've got some time at the end. So wanted to start first with Kara. And you can take it from here. The floor is all yours.
Thanks, Skip. Hi, everyone. Good morning. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Kara Snow, and I work at TAO as the Chief Community Engagement Officer and also the Chief of Staff. And today is my last day of being in charge of the Southern Willamette Valley interim VP-ship because we are having somebody start on Monday. So I'll be glad to just have 2 jobs. Part of what I get to work on is our Tech for Good initiatives, and that includes our design sprints. So we did one in conjunction with this summit and focused on areas of food security, the digital divide, and child health and wellness. For those of you not familiar with our design sprints, it's essentially a hackathon that's deconstructed and completed over the course of a week. And the intent behind it was to make it more inclusive, because I am not sure how familiar you all are with hackathons, but 48 hours in an office building or a gym or conference centers, not always easy for everyone to do, given life's circumstances. So we decided that we were going to deconstruct these into a week and run it more like an agile software development process with a kickoff, and at the end having some kind of solution pitched back. And the other part where we work on the inclusivity is really going into the community to get the projects, working with our government partners to get the data, and then asking our tech community to approach all of the projects in a very empathetic way. So this is now our 3rd iteration. So in the fall of last year, we did a design sprint with nonprofits that serve communities of color. And we had 3 challenges and 3 solutions pitched back. That one had some really interesting outcomes. We actually won a Smart Cities award for inclusive community engagement with that. And then in April, we took this concept of the design sprint online, like everyone else did with everything. And we're a little concerned as to how we would run it. But what we saw was that we were able to actually open it up more. So in April, we did a design sprint around rural innovation. And we had five challenges. We had 5 solutions pitched back. And the narrative was really around bridging the rural-urban divide. And what we learned through the online experience was an event that was supposed to be 20 people in person became 70 people around the country. And we actually had teams from 9 different states, or folks from 9 different states that coordinated and collaborated to pitch back. And so for Techlandia, as I mentioned, we focused on these areas of food security, child health and wellness, and then the digital divide. And I think we had about 35 participants across 7 teams that pitched back 7 solutions to the 3 challenges that we had put before them. And the challenges are really solicited from the community. So we did that in partnership with AT&T, where they support, where they're supporting during this COVID chapter. And so that's how we got connected. And so yesterday was really awesome. We had judges from around the country, actually. And as the solutions were pitched back, they were judged on ROI, aesthetics, usability, the tech, the functionality, the accomplishment, the presentation style. And for the first time ever, we included an equity outcome as part of the presentation back. And we used our partnership with the Trailblazers and shared their equity filter of how to approach a project or a challenge. And so we don't have our winner as of yet. The judges have until Monday to finalize that. But I wanted to share really quickly a couple of the outcomes, and I had to write them down, so that's why I keep looking over here at my notes. Our 3 challenges were around a statewide agriculture data hub. And as we've seen news stories of farmers having to get rid of food and the supply chain, what kind of data do we have, could we have, and trends could we analyze to ensure better food security for folks around the state while providing growers with an additional opportunity to capture revenue. The second challenge was with New Avenues for Youth, and it was around a safe place network app. So where underhoused youth can go, where there is internet access and access to a trusted adult. And then the third was with a group called Care Wheels. And Care Wheels is really interesting. They provide an app that currently exists for seniors to remind them to do things that have become even harder during our social isolation, which is, make sure they open their door to leave their house, take their medicine, and eat something during the day. And that they were looking for some enhanced functionality to allow seniors to interact in a different way that meant they could contribute as well. So giving them a job and some opportunities to earn points for a larger networking type scenario. And so we had 4 teams that pitched back on the Ag Data Hub, and these were from all over the state. We actually had 2 teams from Eugene, and one of those teams was a group of 16 and 17-year-olds. So in high school, that put together a working prototype of a front-end app, which was amazing. And we currently, with the Data Hub, have opportunities to move forward with some pending grant applications and the existing statewide infrastructure and data sets, and then support through various private companies, including Google, Esri, and AWS. So we're working through that. One of the solutions I think did a really good job, because when you talk about data that's available from an ag perspective, it is pretty large and unwieldy, and it is also a competitive advantage for farmers. So how do you capture that information and use it in a way that is thoughtful for all of our community members? And what we have right now with this project is an opportunity to clarify what we're trying to achieve and create a shared frame of reference for everyone that was interested. Because when you have 7 teams and 4 of them work on the Data Hub, there's obviously an interest in ag and data and the food security that comes with that. So we're looking at moving forward by defining a problem as a group, listing off the key stakeholders and stakeholder groups, conducting interviews, building personas and user stories, identifying problems and risks, and then putting together a project timeline, because the state already has great tools in place that are good enough from a tech standpoint. So it's really more about getting everyone to pull together. And so that was really awesome that we now know that we've got about 25 folks around the state that are interested in that. With New Avenues for Youth, the Safe Places for Youth app that was built, they're going to take the roadmap and apply for some funding, because the Safe Place network has not been developed yet, but it is in process. And so if you could roll out a physical network with a app simultaneously, that would be the most beneficial for underhoused youth. And what was really compelling about that presentation last night, you had the high school students and then you had some college students as well. And one of the college students really like pushed from the COVID standpoint of, you know, you're saying these places are safe and it's where I can get Wi-Fi, but does that include the overlay of a pandemic? And would I be able to be 6 feet away from somebody? And the team developing it had not actually thought about that functionality. So it was really awesome. And then the Care Wheels app, the new functionality was created, and the team at Care Wheels is going to use that to apply for some additional funding. They actually are working with Smart Cities PDX, as this is an Internet of Things solution. But the existing application coupled with the new functionality should drive greater adoption in our aged population, which will be really critical as social distancing is going to stay for a while. And what was really awesome about that project was, in my opinion, they applied the equity filter the best. And they actually started their design process by doing research on design for seniors, because the intuition of using a mobile device is something you learn, and it is different at different ages. And so they also built in functionality for mobility and visibility differences. And they were the only ones that had the functionality in multiple languages. So all 3 of the projects are going to move forward. 2 are in a much better place where they're really roadmaps for funding. And the 3rd is just a larger term conversation that we continue having at the statewide level to capture the wonderful ag that we have. And in all of the situations, we can say that there were some bridges that were built, definitely between rural and urban, absolutely between older and youth, and then definitely more thought went into several of the apps when you're talking about BIPOC. So I'll pause, Skip. I don't know if you want me to add anything else, but it was really inspiring, and it was a great week.
Great. Thanks, Kara. That was an excellent summary. And yeah, as you can all tell, it was a really impressive group of folks that devoted a fair amount of time to seven impactful solutions. Next up, we have Charmaine from Supply.
Hi, this is Charmaine, and I had a few thoughts to share around this idea of emerging between the future of work and being determined by those human factors. And so specifically around what are ways that we can engage specifically people of color and Black and Brown communities around entrepreneurship, around innovation, and around technology, and how can we sort of set the standard for helping close the gaps in representation and equality, et cetera. So I believe there's a great opportunity to sort of leverage a lot of the work that TAO has been doing, especially highlighted in Techlandia, around, hey, let's bring all of these voices to the table and let's make sure that everyone has equal access. And, you know, let's problem solve around how we engage Black and Brown communities to get access to the resources that they need, get access to mentorship, funding, etc., to begin to close the gap of representation as well as wealth building, etc. So I just wanted to share that as I think a great potential to continue a lot of the conversations that have been happening through Techlandia so far. Thank you.
Thank you, Charmaine, and that was very very well put. Would you be interested in potentially continuing some of this conversation or the work as we start to move things forward into action from this?
Yeah, I'd love to.
Excellent, excellent. We'll definitely reach out and look forward to chatting more. So next next up, I think Scott had mentioned that he wanted to speak, but I don't see him here in the list. He may have had to drop off. But I did want to transition here to the different micro summits and see first, I guess I'll do a quick little recap of both future work and economic resiliency, and then we can shift to Thomas and Adrian. So in terms of economic resiliency, there were a couple of themes that emerged, and I think they dovetail really nicely with Charmaine's thoughts. One was ownership being very important, and how do we provide more opportunities for folks to essentially start businesses, own intellectual property, get access as well to educational and career opportunities. And I think there's an opportunity as well, as Charmaine said, to think about how we build generational wealth, effectively trying to close the income gap between people of different ethnicities, backgrounds. And I think as well that there's another opportunity too, and Kara alluded to this with the design sprint. So last year, some of the work we did with Multnomah County, with the Port of Portland and other local governments, as well as organizations that serve communities of color, it's a perfect example of how those organizations that are working closely with the community know best what the challenges are. And so by having them define the challenges, the tech community then kind of marshals together resources to deploy them in service to what the community needs, but the community has the ownership over defining the challenge and then ultimately over the tech once it's developed the solution. And I think that's an interesting construct that, definitely merits further work and exploration in terms of how we kind of scale that, and are there different groups and or voices that maybe haven't been included in that work in the past that we should definitely make sure at the table. And I think also there was another idea that came out, which was organizing a working group to create kind of a resource directory of tech solutions for local businesses, neighborhood associations, local government, to kind of bridge that gap between people who need resources, including businesses, and those who have resources or subject matter expertise, maybe within a specific geographic area or neighborhood. And I think one thought was that we could maybe do a pilot around one or more of these available solutions, working with one or more local community partners. On Monday, we had Outer Spatial and Fabric as two solutions that were featured. And Outer Spatial is currently working with the Intertwine Alliance here in Portland. They use Outer Spatial's platform to help connect people to environmental resources and amenities, and share information about like COVID-19 related restrictions in terms of how people can use parks and green space, et cetera. And then there's also, I think, an opportunity to think with Fabric about, since they use augmented reality in kind of a fun, engaging way, and they address some of the issues that Nextdoor has with respect to, just people piling on to different topics, where with Fabric, it's a much more kind of one-to-one connection. It's a great way for people in a neighborhood, for example, to, again, learn about who has subject matter expertise and might be willing to offer that, or has a resource and can help if someone's in need. So one example is like a lot of neighborhoods have these all volunteer groups that are to assemble in the event of an emergency or disaster, and specifically like a seismic event. And so what's often a challenge is who in a particular neighborhood has, access to certain supplies, or who has first responder training. And some of these volunteer groups are trying to figure out, who in my neighborhood, either through my neighborhood association or otherwise, might be willing to offer some expertise. So that could be another interesting use case there. And then another thing that came up was you can't really help people achieve economic prosperity if you don't have, or if you don't also address disparities in education, career access, the environment, health and wellness. And I think as Roz Hudnall mentioned, she was the one who gave the keynote for the Future of Work session. She kind of mentioned this is all connected. So if someone has health issues or disparities and they're not able to access the care they need, obviously it's harder to have them access economic opportunities. If you're solving for one of those, you kind of have to solve for all of them. And then within the future of work, one thing that came up was this idea of developing a set of voluntary data privacy principles for employers that they could opt into out of respect for data privacy concerns for their employees who are working from home. Because as is the case, and we've seen this in a variety of situations on conference calls and the like, is you've got kids in the background or pets or you see inside someone's home. There's a lot of potential data privacy and personal privacy issues related to that, and is there a way for employers to be a little bit more proactive in creating a firewall, if you will, between personal and professional? So that's another sort of interesting potential project. And then finally, under Future of Work, the idea of working with employee resource groups, specifically with Black and Brown employees at tech companies, to think about how to better bring those groups together and create more of a shared experience across companies. Because in some cases at certain companies, there might be only 2 or 3 people in one of those groups. So how, through maybe TAO, can we, maybe working with other partners as well, bring those groups together more effectively? And this is something I know Kara has been doing a lot of work with in her work at TAO. So this one is great validation for something that I think is in process. So that's it. That was my recap from Economic Resiliency and Future of Work. And Adrian or Thomas, either one of you want to go next?
I can go ahead and go next. Had a lot of content that I'll try to cover very, very briefly, which I'm not historically good at. We heard a lot of discussion around the changes in the mobility space. Our transportation mobility industry that myself and many of our speakers and presenters work in is had already been in a massive stage of disruption before the world got disrupted. And the evolution of connected, autonomous, shared, and electric vehicles. Those of us that work in this space every day talk about this as though it's a very common thing, but certainly not everybody is quite as familiar with how rapidly everything is changing. And really, it's the convergence of this connected, autonomous, shared electric space that is causing the massive disruption. There's good news that comes along with that. There are increasingly opportunities for people to not have to own their own vehicle. There's all kinds of new modes and first and last mile options that can connect with transit to give people more choice. But there's a lot of fear with, we'll kind of transition a little bit into and out of the COVID disruption. And it's impossible to talk about any of these things without going there. And as that has disrupted our entire transportation and mobility space, we saw immediate reaction of, all of the shutdown meant hardly anybody is driving anywhere anymore. Huge impacts on the roadway in a positive way, lack of congestion and unfortunately also lack of transit ridership. In some parts of the country, there was no longer a choice for anyone other than essential workers, and then other places, everyone just opted not to ride transit. There's a fear as we, and I think a very justified fear as we enter into recovery, different stages of recovery over the coming weeks and months and longer, probably in a lot of cases, that transit will be slow to recover, and a lot of the forward progress that we were making in terms of allowing people to not have to own a single occupant vehicle and all the benefits that come with that are going to be slowed. And so I think there's going to have to be a very intentional effort within the industry to both show that transit was actually not a regenerator or a massive spread location of the disease like a lot of people had feared. But it's going to have to be very intentional focus in that space to get people back into buses and trains, and a lot of work's going to have to be done there. We're going to, if we're smart about this, we don't have a playbook for recovery from COVID in transportation, just as we don't in any other industry. And so one of the things we're going to have to do is look across the ponds in both directions to Asia and to Europe, who were more successful in flattening their curves and cutting back. We're starting to see some early signs that maybe not as successful as originally hoped, but one way or another, more successful than we've been. And as they continue their recovery and people are using public transportation in both Europe and Asia, we're going to have to learn what is working well, and that's going to be the best playbook that we've got access to. In addition to the connected, autonomous, shared, and electric, Maureen Bach from the Oregon Department of Transportation, the Chief Innovation Officer there, joined us yesterday, talked about their involvement in all of those things, but also their involvement in the road user charge program, which is not nearly as sexy and interesting maybe to a lot of folks as some of these other technologies, but it's really critical to the way that we're going to pay for and manage the maintenance and operations of our roadways in the future. We've been historically not just heavily, almost entirely reliant on the gas tax to pay for maintenance of our roads. That was not looking good economically for a really long time. It's not politically popular to raise our gas taxes. And so the government's always been behind in pushing that. But more importantly, cars have been getting more efficient even prior to hybrids and electric vehicles really starting to take off. Cars were already getting more efficient. Now with hybrids and electrics, the point with all of that is there is not an even distribution of those that are using our roadways that are paying for our roadways. And the economics just don't pan out in the long run anyway, unless we pivot to a road user charge program where people are actually paying for use of the roadway, not paying at the pump. And ODOT and the state of Oregon have been national industry leaders in that space. And Maureen shared a lot of that with us yesterday. She also talked about the electric vehicle part of this. The governor signed a executive directive a little while ago on climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. And among many other things within that executive order was a big push to electrify fleets, electrify the fleets that the state of Oregon runs in many, many departments, but also promoting and helping build out the electric vehicle infrastructure to allow citizens to make this transition. And so ODOT's going to be taking a high profile role in promoting electric vehicles. So back to the COVID disruption a little bit, there's been some interesting things that have happened in the transportation space. Our cities in a lot of cases have responded very quickly. We're always looking for the silver linings and whatever slivers of good news we can get out of all this. And one of the ones that was highlighted is things that would normally take government many, many months of planning and community outreach and funding and approvals and list the and programs that would be years before they would deploy. They deployed in a matter of weeks, and things like our slow streets and healthy streets, where the city has blocked off a number of streets and opened them up to slow down the traffic on those streets and open them up to bike and pedestrian use, so people can get out of their houses and safely, if they're using social distancing and other things, still move around healthy. And that's been very quick to adopt. We talked a bit about making sure those and any of these other programs that were moving forward, there was already an increased focus on equity and community outreach. And I think here's where we get our crossover into Thomas's. I should have ended with this and handed the baton to you, but the message in transportation around really working together with community-based organizations and identifying community need, and whether it's safe, healthy street or any other sort of investment. Again, we'd already, as an industry, like to think we had improved recognition on the importance of that. That's been made all the more clear with the larger equity conversation that we've been having across our country. And I think one of the points that I'm going to want to end with, and Thomas, I think you'll probably end up kind of ending with a similar call to action, or at least a supportive, slightly modified call to action. But the one thing that we touched on multiple times and didn't really get into too much of a so what and what can we do about it, and then maybe Skip, this will kind of come back to a what can we do about it within the Technology Association and our Smart Cities group and some of the other labs and communities that you have, is around the changing workforce. And so when we talk about all that disruption that's happening in the mobility space, where our agencies like Oregon DOT are shifting from infrastructure builders and infrastructure managers into mobility managers, increasingly automating these different systems. We talked about how that doesn't mean jobs are being replaced. It means new jobs are being created to replace older jobs that the reason that we're automating them is people don't want to do them. But somebody needs to run the machines. We talked just really briefly about how automation doesn't really mean the systems are completely running themselves. And so there's a huge opportunity, should we rise to the challenge, on figuring out how to respond to the needs of this changing workforce. And I think that there's immediate elements to that. There's long range elements to that. So I think there's things from the STEM programs in our schools and really starting to educate a new workforce that's going to be ready for these new jobs in the coming decades. But I also think there might be an opportunity here when we think about some of these jobs being displaced, when we think about looking for newer, higher paying jobs for all kinds of people that are transitioning or wanting to just move up the social ladder, that we should be working with our community colleges and other workforce retraining programs and helping identify what these new jobs are and what the training opportunities are there. And I have to admit, it's an area that I know very little about what we're already doing and what the Technology Association is already doing. And so I kind of want to offer that I'll get engaged in that conversation and helping connect some of the opportunities that we see coming down the track to programs that will help fill those needs. So I know I missed quite a few things that we've talked about that were really important, but those are some of the ones that really resonated with me. So with that, I'll hand it to you, Thomas.
Thanks, Adrian. Yeah, I just wanted to survey some of the human factors talks, and then I've got some ideas, and I'll try to share my screen and share some graphics and see if that works. But just to wrap up the human factors track, we had a really full program and a pretty meaty program. I'm just looking over our handout. We started off with this talk on how do we design for inclusion and digital justice. And, this idea of liberatory design or just or equitable design came up, and I want to return to that because I think that's going to be a takeaway going forward. How can product designers take responsibility for their influence on society? How do they learn ethics? How do they deal with implicit bias? We moved into an interesting talk around economic resiliency in the outdoors and the outer spatial program and using apps and various technologies to help connect people with nature in the natural world, trails and things like that. And that plays into quality of life in Oregon, and it plays into, employee resiliency and companies, supporting their workers. We talked about some interesting apps like the Fabric app, which is an interesting augmented reality social networking app. We also got into a very interesting discussion on data and law enforcement budgets, and how do we think about city budgets? How do we, address this idea of, defunding the police, and what does that really mean? And how can we begin to use data to even understand where money goes in a city, and how to direct that money toward thriving in health, and how does that play into law enforcement? And Greg Schundler had a great example of using data just to answer some of these questions. I recommend. We talked about social responsibility and corporate social responsibility, and learned about what was happening at Keen Shoes, how they're working both to support their workers, and how to move to a more remote work style, and also how to support the community. We talked about telehealth and access and the healthcare system. And it really, that talk exposed a lot of structural issues in the healthcare system, just as in law enforcement. So we were really looking at ways to look at the world in a new way. We had that great talk earlier today with Jessica and Carmen about empowerment economics and small business and micro lending. So really fascinating stuff. I'm going to try to share my screen, and if this doesn't work, I'll just verbally speak. But I want to share a couple of images that I thought were really helpful. Can't really see what I can't see what my screen is showing you, unfortunately. But there should be are you seeing the Higgs index?
The Sustainable Apparel Coalition.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
These are things I want to follow up on, the idea of the Higgs index. Well, let me back up. I think going forward, we need to think about design and how things are made and what processes we use around design. There's a number of models that came up this week that I think we can package and use. And one is the Higgs index, which is used by the apparel industry. I won't go into details about it, but it is a model to help look at the supply chain and look at sustainability within shoes and apparel. But it's a design tool. And I think this is going to be one that's going to be really helpful, particularly with some of the big players here in Oregon around, athletics and apparel. And I'm going to see if I can then share this broad idea of liberatory design. This is something that Tanya talked about at our design talk earlier in the week. And there's a whole method here for doing design that builds in community input. So we don't have the problems that people talked about where we just give lip service to community acts, to talking to the community. We have a preordained idea, we have a focus group, we get that information, we check the box, and then we do what we plan to do anyway. This is more building in that participatory process, and this is well developed. And according to their method, it just adds about 50 to 90 minutes to a design program. So we're talking about taking an extra half an hour to an hour to our traditional designing programs to really build in this kind of liberatory social justice approach. So I think what we're wanting to achieve is doable, and that leads us to this idea of empowerment economics, which was talked about earlier. Hopefully you can see this slide saying traditional financial capabilities approach. But the idea that traditionally, in terms of empowering people, it's really mainstream financial institutions, working within the status quo, looking at individual level factors, the individual person, what is their knowledge about finances and things like that. Whereas an empowerment economics view really starts with a social justice orientation. It begins in the community, it begins with coalition, it begins with building self-efficacy and looking at the whole person. It's culturally relevant. And so the outcomes are not just simply empowering one business or one person to get a loan, but it's really building a multi-generational system within the community to break some of these durable inequalities. So point I'm trying to make is that there are existing models. There are existing models out there that people are using. And then, especially, and all adding in the data analysis tools that Greg shared. I think we have some things that are sitting around that we could use in future, future talks and future work. So the idea of design, as Tanya talked about early on in our first session, from the liberatory design standpoint, some of these social justice, durable inequality issues, they're designed. They have been designed, often consciously, often in a conscious discriminatory way, and they can be undesigned. And so there is a real kind of an empowering message there. We can design new systems and undesign old systems. So that's sort of my takeaway. I mean, I had this larger sense of society. There's been these talks of defunding the police and things like that, and looking at these really 19th, 20th century models that we're still using in the 21st century. But quite frankly, when we were talking about healthcare and telehealth and all the fragmentation in our healthcare, I had a sense, well, we need to defund the hospitals too. We needed to fund everything. We need to start from scratch on a lot of areas. So a theme that came up was just, bringing ourselves into the 21st century on a lot of levels. So I was really empowered personally by our talk, and I think there's a lot to go forward. That's what I have.
Excellent. Thank you, Thomas and Adrian. I was able to take some notes during both of your discussions. So I think what we'll do is we'll try and put this all into a document that we can then discuss at our July Smart Cities group meeting about how we potentially move this forward into some different, essentially work groups. What do we want to prioritize? How do we, for example, to Thomas's point, implement some of these frameworks and some of the projects that we're doing? What might be some opportunities to, think about other capabilities of TAO, like some of the workforce and talent work that we're doing, to Adrian's point? Why don't we apply it to the application of mobility, right? And there's a huge opportunity, I think, given the number of companies and organizations and the leadership role that government plays here in the state, around new mobility solutions. And so I think there's some cool opportunities there as well. Adrian, one thing that the state of Oregon is working on right now is an innovation plan that would govern the state for 5 to 10 years with some clear economic development outcomes. But they're trying to look for intersection points between economic and, for example, people or human networks or mobility and infrastructure. And so I think it presents a great opportunity to provide input in that process, and they're already in touch with us and want input. And so I think that if folks from the community, want to share some of the ideas that came up during Techlandia or other things they've been working on, we have an opportunity and sort of a vehicle through TAO by which those voices can be heard and hopefully ideas can be incorporated into the state's work. So that's one short-term opportunity, I think, where we can share some of these ideas and hopefully get them baked into a multi-year plan. And then to Thomas's point too earlier, we have things like the Civic Innovation Challenge, which are coming out from the federal government, and those all represent great opportunities to potentially leverage some funding. But again, to Carmen's point at MISO, it's like, how do we get more of the community and the community organizations that serve the community involved in some of this process? So I think those are all things that really resonated, at least with me personally, during some of these report outs. I'm also excited to get folks like Charmaine involved, that enjoyed the conference and maybe want to roll up their sleeves a bit with us and see if we can do things differently and have more different impact. So let's see. Riley, wanted to give a shout out to her. She's been doing a lot of work on the TAO side over the last many months, but also, of course, this past week. Also Justin Martinez, Kara Snow, and also Ruthie Ditzler on our team, all of who have stepped up at different points during the design sprint and also the Techlandia Summit. And we couldn't have done this without them. And of course, all the volunteers who led the micro summits, and the people who helped put together the programming. So big round of applause virtually to all of you. And we'll be reconvening, as I said, in July virtually. So if any of you who attended this want to look for ways to get more involved in some of this work as it moves forward, definitely shoot me a note. My email is up on the TAO website. It's just skip.newberry@techoregon.org. And then also what we'll be doing is we'll be making sure all this content in video form gets up on the TAO YouTube channel. So if you missed any of the sessions, we'll be sharing those out over the next week. Any last words, Adrian or Thomas?
I just want to echo the thanks to everybody that attended, and especially those that are still hanging around here on Friday after a lot of sessions and a lot of content. And yeah, Skip, I'll follow up with you on the State of Oregon Innovation Plan. We'll see how we can get engaged with that. And yeah, I just want to double down on my offer to start to get a little bit more engaged in the workforce reeducation, STEM, and other programs. Find out what TAOs are already doing and figure out how to help expand that for our industry. Thank you.
Excellent.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thanks to all the folks at TAO working behind the scenes, pulling all this together, and the website and all that stuff. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. And of course, thank you again to all the supporters that helped make this happen. We're all listed here on this slide. And yeah, I hope you all have a great rest of your Friday. Enjoy the nice weather and have a nice weekend. That's a wrap.